Kenmore City Council is now in session pursuant to RCW 42.30.110(1)I. The City Council will now enter into an executive session to discuss potential litigation. This session is slated to last approximately 30 minutes until 7 p.m. No final action is expected. Kenmore City Council will adjourn our special meeting and call the regular meeting to order. Would the clerk please take the roll?
Councilmember Marshall,
Present.
Councilmember Sassen,
Here.
Councilmember Shrubnik,
Here.
Councilmember Lutzis,
Here.
Councilmember Culver.
Here.
Mayor Herbig,
Here.
and Deputy Mayor Kane is excused.
Unless there are any objections, she is excused.
Great.
Next on the agenda is the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the city of Kenmore is situated upon the ancestral lands of the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Sauk-Suatal, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and other tribes who are part of the Coast Salish peoples. We recognize and express our deepest respect for their enduring stewardship and profound relationship with this land, which they have cherished and protected since time immemorial. We honor the First Peoples, acknowledge their vibrant cultures, and commit ourselves to learning from their wisdom in our journey to promote justice, equity, and mutual understanding. We pledge to stand alongside these communities in acknowledging past injustices and working towards a future that respects and celebrates the diverse heritage of this land. Would you all please now stand and join me in the flag salute? I pledge allegiance to the flag. Next on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Unless there are any objections, the agenda will stand approved as published. Seeing no objections, the agenda is approved. Mr. City Manager, where's the fun?
You know, to answer that question, I'd like to turn it over to our Deputy City Manager, Stephanie Lukash.
Hi. So you can see from the picture where I'm going with Where's the Fun this week. Hot off the press. It's time to cool off, and the coolest spot in town, City of Kenmore's beloved water feature in Town Square, was turned on last week for the spring and summer season. Families and small kids immediately frolicked in the water, as you can see in the picture, and enjoyed a splash and stoop. Brewing even used the water feature in their social media posts over the weekend, inviting the community to enjoy a slice of pizza in Town Square with the scenic fountain as the backdrop. And that's Bill Garza, one of our Public Works crews. We want to thank our crew for all of their work and getting the water feature up and running, and then they'll be keeping it maintained, of course, throughout the season, and that is a body of work. So we want to appreciate them for their efforts. Just encourage everyone to come down and have a seat, enjoy the water feature, and it's going to be a fun place to enjoy the spring and summer in Kenmore.
Fantastic, thank you. Next on the agenda is public comment. Welcome to the council's meeting. Please address your comments to the mayor and council. Folks will have 3 minutes to speak. Unless there are more than 20 speakers, then time will be reduced down to 2 minutes. The clerk will call your name when it is your turn. The presiding officer may choose to alternate between in-person and online comments. Please state your name and city of residence and keep within the allotted time. To make every person feel welcome and safe here, please refrain from booing, clapping, heckling, yelling, or other interruptions. This meeting is recorded for transparency. Thank you for being here and sharing your input respectfully. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Mayor. We have 2 individuals signed up for on-site public comment, and we'll take them in this order. Jonathan Lowndes, followed by Aaron McDonald.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. Jonathan Lowndes, Bellevue, Washington. I'm here representing the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish Counties. As you study the tree code issue tonight and consider the proposed amendments, I want to emphasize the importance of this discussion and highlight 3 key points. First, our region is currently facing a housing affordability and attainability crisis. Kenmore's recent community survey results show that the housing affordability is a top issue for Kenmore residents. Without the proposed amendments to the tree code, this issue will be exacerbated as the current tree code stifles the possibility of new development, including middle housing development, which is also being discussed tonight. Secondly, City Council needs to consider broader environmental goals. As the city has stated itself, allowing for responsible tree cutting inside of King County's urban growth boundary for the purpose of increasing urban housing supply prevents even more trees from being cut down in outside of the urban sprawl and rural areas. The current tree code undermines these broader environmental efforts by pushing development outside the urban growth boundary. Lastly, City Council needs to consider the impacts of the tree code on meeting the housing goals outlined in Kenmore's comprehensive plan and the intent of the Growth Management Act. GMA outlines 15 goals, which also emphasize the importance of avoiding urban sprawl, safeguarding private property rights, and making provisions for adequate housing. The tree code as it currently stands runs counter to the intent of the GMA and thwarts Kenmore's ability to meet its housing goals by preventing development. Thank you for your time and consideration of this important matter. The Master Builders Association stands ready to answer any questions as you guys consider this important subject. Thank you.
Aaron McDonald.
Good evening, City Council. Aaron McDonald, Kenmore citizen. And real quick, I have to agree, the tree cutting,
Mr. McDonald, you need to address your comments
the
towards the
tree
council.
cutting code definitely has been an issue. And I'd like that to be relooked at in terms of property rights, but I'm not here for that tonight. So I watched the most recent Kenmore Planning Commission meeting on YouTube, several of them actually. And following the opening of the meeting and the land acknowledgement, the commission stood and recited the Pledge of Allegiance, which was audible for all listeners, both in person and online. I've also watched many city council meetings online and have noted that microphones are shut off for the pledge, including tonight. Why is this? Why is the meeting muted for online viewers during the Pledge of Allegiance? As evidenced by the YouTube videos of Planning Commission meetings on March 5th and April 2nd, it is not a technical shortcoming, but rather a conscious decision to handle it this way, made either by a staff member or by council. I request that the practice of muting the Pledge of Allegiance for online viewers cease and be made audible for all. Also, I watched last week's council meeting and the permanent supportive housing element discussion with interest. Councilmember Culver, who I think is listening online, your take on the matter that it's the law and we have to follow it is a significant and refreshing change of pace. Specifically, the departure from your lack of regard for traffic law, which you habitually decide is not worth following. Target zero indeed. Or is it that you only believe in following the law if you feel it is in alignment with your personal and moral advocacy? I suspect the latter. Furthermore, it is your fiduciary duty to advocate for the citizens of Kenmore, not enforcement of state law. Perhaps your calling is in the State Attorney General's office rather than in the Kenmore City Council. As Tammy Quirk and Councilmember Srebnick stated in the previous council meeting, Kenmore is a services desert. I'm curious how this conclusion aligns with the directive to greenlight the development of permanent supportive housing when the supportive element does not exist in Kenmore. It is up to local government to establish guidelines and guardrails such as location, density, and on-site services. I submit that the supportive element must exist on-site insofar as 1, Kenmore does not have local supportive services in place, and 2, transportation to a distant supportive services provider does not meet the plain and unambiguous definition of permanent supportive housing. Instead, such a design is simply permanent housing without the supportive services. It is unquestionably under the council's purview to mandate the minimum level of supportive services that must be provided on-site in order to satisfy a level of care appropriate for the residents of such a facility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. That concludes on-site public comment. Can we move on to virtual?
Of course.
Great. We have one virtual comment who pre-registered, Patrick O'Brien. Give me one moment.
Hello, testing.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hi there. Pat O'Brien here, Kenmore, Washington. We just had a finance forum put together with a PowerPoint and the finance director. And I heard it through the grapevine that Nigel said that the format that they tried to use wasn't going to work. And it really didn't, because during the PowerPoint, several misstatements by the finance director's people were evident, and there was no opportunity for a public comment. So I went ahead and did it anyway. At any rate, we're looking for guidance here. The Arch 2024 Affordable Housing, it's an executive board decision. And the approval is required by member councils, and no comments were received. So in that statement, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. But what you fail to point out is number one is identify and help local displaced people from Kenmore. I don't care what color, what religion, anything, but if they're local, we have an opportunity to look at that first. And then in your document tonight, it says Lake Point, seek opportunities to activate Lake Point priority. I'd say test it first. You have been loath to test it. And there's been time after time where they say, oh, we need to not have any significant test, PCBs, dioxins, lead, arsenic mandated by the city. You need to do that on all your projects that are suspect, and you just don't. So now we look at a public safety aspect of that, and you know, you can't have continued spending with on Lake Point until you really come together with what you're trying to accomplish. And you can't know what you're going to accomplish unless you do thorough testing. So let's get to the significant testing, and let's inform the finance director that yes, a lot of money has been spent on Lake Point for partnerships, staff, and money for decades. She seemed to be unaware of that. And how to save money? Well, the Kenmore maintenance facility is a boondoggle still. We don't know what the final cost for that is. The rowing club, as ever, the fees for that are not taken. The staff size is just out of sight. And the League of Cities cost is absolutely preposterous. You need to diverge. You need to get us out of the League of Cities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor, that concludes all of our public comment signups this evening.
Thank you to everybody who made your voices heard. We appreciate it. Next on the agenda is the consent agenda. The chair would entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The consent agenda stands approved. All right, now we've got two study sessions items. We're going to move down to the tables for those discussions. And just so everybody knows, there will be a 5-minute break between the two study session items. All right, our first study session agenda item is Middle Housing Concepts and Options, joined by planning commissioners, presented by Community Development Director Debbie Bent, Principal Planner Todd Hall, Kelly Horn, Kelly Horn Consultant Clay White. Oh, okay, sorry. And Nick Chen, also a consultant. Turn over to you.
Yep. Well, good evening, Council, Planning Commission members. Thank you for coming this evening. It is on.
It's on.
Yeah, thank you. So just as a little reminder about middle housing and the journey that we've been on, if you recall, the council adopted comprehensive plan policies at the end of 2022 for middle housing. And then in 2023, the state law changed. So we now have mandates for middle housing and also mandates for accessory dwelling units. So also last year we had a commerce grant and did significant outreach, and that report was presented to you in September of last year. We are lucky to have an additional commerce grant to assist with implementation regulations. So that's why we hired a consultant, and they're going to help us develop new comprehensive plan policies and the land use and housing elements, as well as implementation regulations for middle housing, as well as accessory dwelling units, cottage housing, and small houses on small lots. So that's just to give you kind of a context of where we're being and where we're going. So tonight, we invited our consultants to do a little presentation to kind of give you a sort of a chat about what some of those policy questions are, and thought it would be helpful to have both the Planning Commission and Council in the room at the same time to be able to hear each other's questions before the Planning Commission start work on this docket item. So I'd like to turn it over to Clay and Nick, who are the consultants from Kimley Horn. Thank you.
Great, I think that we're on here. So council members, planning commission members, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to be here with you tonight. One of the things I find that's great about these types of study sessions is it's, especially when we're doing a project overview, is it's an opportunity for us to listen up front before we go too far as we're working with the team to hear about what your concerns are, what you want to see, the things that we can incorporate, and then we mix that with what some of the statutory requirements are, because we want to get you really good information so you can make good decisions. And the more that we can listen to you up front, then the better document we'll bring back to you. So we're going to keep this pretty short tonight, and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. And we'll be back in front of you as this process goes through. So this will be the first time tonight. So just a few kind of things that we want to make sure that we cover tonight. We'll do our project team introductions. We'll talk briefly about the legislation that was passed, and so why we're here and what we have to cover as part of this project. Briefly review the project overview and schedule. We'll talk a little bit about the engagement approach for this project. We'll take questions and get early feedback from both the Planning Commission and City Council, and then we'll talk a little bit about next steps. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, members of council, planning commission. It's great to be able to talk to you. As Clay mentioned, we're going to talk to you a little bit tonight about House Bill 1110 and implementing guidance for it. I'm going to come back a little bit later and talk about some different housing types that are options as part of House Bill 1110, as well as project schedule and a couple broader range questions for discussion later on. But I'm going to pass back to Clay.
Great. And just to give you a little bit of background, before I joined the private sector, I spent 18 years working for cities and counties. So, you know, whenever I'm working on a project, I'm trying to look at it from how will it, you know, I'm working with a city council or a county council, or I'm thinking about how it's going to be implemented at the front counter. But, you know, having that perspective I found is really important. I was able to work on phase one of this project. So for the council members that were here, I've done some presentations before you before. I also, our team has been able to work on the House Bill 1110 guidance for the Department of Commerce. So we've been helping to develop the guidance that's going to help facilitate this project as well. So what I can promise you is I may not have all the answers to your questions tonight, but if I don't have an answer, I'll make sure I'll get you the answer. So that's a good part of this process tonight. So just really briefly, I know that you've had a lot of conversations about housing, and so I'm going to keep this pretty tight. But House Bill 1110 was passed by the legislature in 2023, and it requires the city of Kenmore to adopt housing policies. I think the important thing about the policies is you're also updating your comprehensive plan right now, housing element requirement. So they kind of go hand in hand. And so I think when we hit the schedule a little bit later, you'll see the work that we'll be looking and reviewing any policy changes go along with the housing element change, because it's really one project. And then we have to implement regulations to allow more middle housing in residential zones. So, you know, one of the important factors to be thinking about is that there's a requirement to have this completed by June 30th of next year. However, we're trying to roll this in as part of the overall comprehensive plan work. So when you see things later this summer and fall, that we can make it part of that project. If the city doesn't take legislative action by June 30th of next year, a lot of the state law automatically goes into effect. And so it really reduces the control that you have or the regulations you can apply or how you apply them. So that's not the case for all legislation. Sometimes if you don't adopt it, you might get appealed or something else might happen. In this case, a lot of the legislation goes into full force and effect after June 30th of next year. And the requirements are modified by the city population. So one of the things we're talking about tonight is that the requirements change when a city passes the 25,000 population threshold. And that's exactly where the city of Kenmore is. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference of the requirements. The legislation mostly applies to your lower density residential zones, your R1, R4, and R6 zones. You know, those that are dedicated to higher densities already allow densities that supersede what's in the legislation. So you can kind of think about it that way. The legislation does a whole bunch of different things, but it limits the ability of the city to place regulations on middle housing that are more restrictive than what you place on single family residential housing. That could be things like heights, setbacks. I mean, all the little bulk standard regulations that you apply, you wouldn't be able to put more regulations on middle housing. Design review must be administrative if you have that process. So there's some new limitations on kind of design review process. I think a lot of that came out of the Seattle process of long kind of lead times for project reviews. It limits parking requirements under most circumstances, unless you get like an empirical parking study. So as part of this, we'll be comparing those parking requirements to what the current code requires. And then it permits subdivision of these new units. So one thing, it's kind of a technical piece is, we always think of things in terms of density. In this zone, you're allowed this many units per acre. This legislation looks at things completely different. It's number of units that are allowed on a lot. So what that would mean is, if you had a parcel and you were able to subdivide it into 4 units, then this would apply to those individual lots. So we're gonna have to find a way as we put the code together of how a user could, how this could be user-friendly for someone to understand the difference between density and lot yield. So if you're thinking about this, if you have any questions, because it's confusing. I mean, it was confusing for me, and I was writing, you know, some of the guidance. So we have to figure out a way that it's clearly understandable for those that live in the city, for those that are wanting to use the code, for the staff, and you know, so there's some challenges in implementation. So the 2023 City of Kenmore population estimate was right about that 25,000 threshold. And, you know, our suggestion is we've outlined kind of the tier two requirements, which are those that are over 25,000 population, and those that are tier 3, which are under 25,000. I mean, our suggestion is that we'd be applying the tier 2 requirements. If not, you'll be coming back and rewriting the code again about the time probably next year. And so, but we want to make sure we're discussing this with you, yes.
Real quick question on the bottom middle cube, the 4 units, when near major transit, your previous map showed major transit coming up Juanita Drive and over 155th. Can you speak to that? I think, at least I was under the impression that major transit literally meant 522 only.
So it's actually a really good point. And to kind of go to how complicated this legislation is, there's actually a bill that passed this session that modified the definition of major transit stop. So that map was put together previously as part of the phase 1 work. So we're going to be looking to redo that mapping to show where that would actually apply. And we haven't done that exercise yet, but there are some areas that would be identified. And previously it was areas that was outside of 522. Because it encompassed, I think it was some of the bus service.
Yes, so yes, when we were looking at this previously, it was the 522 bus route, and then the route that runs up
Right.
Juanita Drive and across 153rd. So I think this is what that map was based on, but I think the clarification will probably be just to apply to 522 at this point. So we need to update the maps.
Yes, there's I mean, just like this legislation passed 2 sessions ago, there's been legislation, more than one piece of legislation to clarify portions of this legislation, to reduce some definitions. So as part of our early work, we'll be setting that foundation of where this would be applicable. So we'll talk about it in a little bit, but one of the things.
Sorry, I think we have a question
Oh,
from
I'm
Councilmember
sorry. Yeah.
Lucas.
And just back to that point about that middle box, could you remind us again very quickly what near major transit means, what those parameters are?
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far because it's redefined the definition of what that means, but that would usually be like near bus rapid transit lines.
I mean about how far, sorry.
Quarter mile.
Quarter mile, thank you.
Yes. All right. So you can see the difference between the under 25 and over 25 population. But the main difference is that instead of allowing 2 units per lot, so if you had a home, if you had a single family home, allowing 1 additional unit, or if you remove that home, a duplex or that kind of thing, that this would kind of up it to where you would be allowing 4 units per lot when near major transit, or when at least 1 affordable housing unit is provided. I'm not going to go through the definition of what the housing affordability is, but it is defined in the statute. There is still the requirement to allow 6 of the 9 middle housing types. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. One kind of just like nuance, just because something is allowed doesn't mean it's permitted. So you may allow right now 6-plex in a zone, but if the density only allowed you to have 5 units, you can't build a 6-plex. So not everything that is always allowed would be permitted when you apply for a permit. You'd have to still meet all of the development regulations. So it's a nuance, but it's really important because we don't want the public to think just because certain housing types are allowed in certain zones that everyone could build those housing types on every single lot. All of your development regulations are still going to apply the same they would to all other development proposals. They can't be more restrictive than the current regulations, but all of the current regulations apply. If you can't meet the regulations, then you wouldn't build the housing. So just because something's allowed doesn't mean that it's always going to be permitted. And then one of the things that we'll be exploring is that there's more than one way to implement House Bill 1110. So there's the kind of the standard requirements, which would be allowing 6 of the 9 housing types, 2 units per lot, 4 units when one's affordable or near major transit. There's an alternative to the density requirements where you can apply this to 75% of residential zones. And that may sound good if you're wanting to focus in certain areas. If you do the math, I don't know if it's always going to work that way though, because you're still going to apply your critical areas regulations to all development. If you can't meet your critical areas regulations, you're not going to build homes in all of your other bulk standards. So I don't know if it will necessarily reduce that many areas where you could build. If you removed, and there's certain provisions of what needs to be included in the 25% area, things like critical areas or areas where you might see a lot of displacement. But when you apply, I don't know if it's really going to be that fruitful, because if we removed a whole bunch of critical areas from being able to develop, those regulations would still apply regardless if it was allowed in the underlying zoning, if that makes sense. There's also an alternative local option where the city can implement actions which are substantially similar to the standard requirements. So if you want to, yes.
Sorry, I need to go back to your last comment. You just said, you were talking about the alternative density requirements, and you said you're not sure if it'd be quote unquote fruitful. I'm curious, are you coming to this with the expectation that we're trying to stop development, or are you coming in here with specific expectations as to which way the council wants to go? Because it sounded to me like you were implying that might be a way that we might view that as a way to stymie development, and that might not be fruitful and towards that goal. And I'm a little concerned if our consultant is coming here with a kind of anti-density starting point. And maybe I just totally misheard you and read that wrong, but that's kind of how I heard that comment.
Well, I'm sorry that you heard it that way. It certainly
Okay.
wasn't intended that way. What I was intending to mean is that by removing the 25% from your lot yield, it doesn't necessarily, it may not actually reduce what areas are actually developable or increase them. So just some people's mind go to, if you remove 25%, we would take it and not allow development within this one area because we want to protect critical areas or something. Those areas are already protected. So there's more nuance than just saying 75, 25, or 100%. So if that was misunderstood, my apologies.
No, I appreciate the clarification. I apologize that I jumped to conclusions. Thank you.
And then there's an alternative local action. You can implement actions which are substantially similar to the standard requirements. I mean, I'm not sure, it would be pretty difficult to come up with something that would be the same, but it'd be a little bit different. We could explore that. If you do that, then it does set some pretty good sideboards in the statute, and then it has to be approved by the Department of Commerce. So if there is something that you want to do that is a little bit different than what the statute provides for, I mean, that would be a kind of a longer path. It's more intricate, but that's certainly something that is on the table. Nate? Or
Yeah.
Nick, sorry.
Yeah. To continue on, so as Clay mentioned, the bill requires if you're a tier 2 jurisdiction to, or if you go that route of tier 2 jurisdiction, to allow 6 of the 9 housing types. The 9 housing types described in the bill are on the screen here. I won't go through all of them, but some of the more common ones are duplex, triplex. You start to get into townhouses and cottages. As you go through, you can see a number of these here. It is not prescriptive. You don't have to pick certain one. I mean, the number of 6 is a goal you need to hit, but in terms of which housing types you select, it really is up to the community. And it's going to be one of the reasons that we reach out to the community to hear about the different housing types that are preferable. There may be some that fit Kenmore better in terms of the community. And so hearing feedback from the community and from you all as we go throughout this process is going to be really important. And we're happy if you'd like us to come back at a later point and describe these in more detail. These are a couple of representative pictures for discussion tonight, but as you go through and you want to get more information, just let us know. If you want to go, I can talk a little bit about project schedule
We
as
have
well.
a question.
Oh, yeah.
Councilmember Schrebeck?
Yeah, are ADUs considered separate from duplexes or part of duplex? I mean, is it one of the 9, I guess?
ADUs are separate. They're not one of the 9 now.
Sorry, Chair Thompson. Trying to dig up the right title for you.
That's all right. Well, a lot of people have problems with that anyway. So, you know, when this type of stuff goes to court, a lot of what the judges look at is legislative intent. And they look at the discussions, particularly on the floor, and those that come with the majority, not with the minority, but with the majority of the legislature when they pass it. And they read that very carefully and then interpret the law with that in mind. What is your opinion about the legislative intent when we start looking, you know, the couple other slides about density and exceptions or other alternatives that we could use? What's your perspective on if you were a judge, what would you be particularly concerned about?
I guess, is there a specific kind of issue that you're concerned about that I could, I mean, I know that when we put together the guidebooks and associated with commerce, we had an attorney that helped us because it's kind of confusing language in some areas and trying to understand what the legislative intent, because some bills, 1337 doesn't always mix, the ADU legislation doesn't always mix with House Bill 1110. So trying to figure out, there's some legislative intent of which bill went first. And so that means this, but is there a specific situation that you have in mind?
No, I was thinking that with where you've been researching this already, is there a body of thought about where that intent may land? Is it going to really be tougher for a municipality to be a little more liberal, or is it going to be tougher to be restrictive, you know, when we get sued because some developer or some community member just doesn't like what we're doing?
I think that just take a good read. You can't predict what someone else in the community might feel or think or what their opinion is. So I think that, we'll do a good job of trying to put together an ordinance that reflects the vision that you want to see, but also implements the statute. And I think you just have to go from there of, understand the legislation, what it requires you to do, develop an ordinance that implements that. And you can't, if someone's doesn't want you to adopt it or does want you to do more, then that's what you'll consider when legislation comes to both the Planning Commission and City Council.
And then one of the things you'll help us is where those fences are on both sides so that we obviously don't get into problem.
We'll certainly give
That's
you.
what that's the other way to say what you're just said, right?
Yeah, I think all of us will give you our opinion on what we think the legislation says and how it can be implemented, and then you'll work with your legal team if there's legal questions.
They're ready to work. I already know.
And if I could add to that, I mean, the Department of Commerce is given a model ordinance and given guidance on some of these questions for interpretation. So we'll also be taking a look at that too, because again, reading legislation and the intent and interpretation is important, but that's what a lot of work that the Department of Commerce has already done.
Oh, good. Thank
you. Take a look at the project schedule now. So Clay mentioned their outreach is going to be an extremely important part of this process, making sure the community understands what's going on. These bills are complicated, as we talked about, making sure everyone, as best we can, is working from a baseline of understanding for what this could mean for the community, what these different opportunities are, and making sure they can give good informed feedback as we ask for it, because that really is what helps us to create a good end plan. As you go through, we can see we're in April right now. This is all for 2024. We are tracking, as Clay mentioned, this process along with the comprehensive plan update, because we do consider them really bonded in that sense that this project is going to support draft housing policies for the housing element, and a lot of the draft regulations are going to be prepared simultaneously with that, so that these can go through public meetings and go through hearings at the same time, be considered because they are so closely tied. You'll notice a couple things. We are here at the PC in Town Hall tonight in April. And there is also, you see a potential check-in with Planning Commission and City Council in June. We're recommending that because actually part of the grant from Commerce does require that a draft outline at least be prepared by June of this year, to give some direction in terms of where the city is going. And we'd love your feedback on that. So we've prepared that check-in point to make sure that we fulfill that part of the grant requirement, that we're coming back to you all to get your feedback. And that is not a finished product. That is not a full draft code or anything like that. That is just the outline of direction and where we're going, and providing Commerce with some of that reassurance. And then I think as we go forward, I can go to a little bit more about community engagement and just kind of outline. This is not going to go date by date in terms of opportunities and the different outreach events, but more topical in terms of reasoning and intent behind this community engagement. And really the first part is educational, to make sure we're building off the work that was done in phase one. I know some of you all were involved in that work, and if you're not, there's a wealth of information on the website that I'm sure a lot of you have taken a look at. And building off of that as part of this is really important, because the community's already given a lot of really good feedback on housing, on different housing types. As Clay mentioned, there has been some changes to the bill. There have been some things that have tweaked process just a little bit, and we want to make sure the community understands that too. So making sure that we walk people through that, whoever would like to be informed, like to be part of these processes, go through and walk through those requirements as well. We want to make sure that we provide opportunities outside of settings like this, that we're going out into the community. We're going to either open houses or different community events. And so we are working with staff right now to identify what those events will be, and the best way to make sure we try and capture as much of the community's feedback as possible. And that will, to the best of our ability, include parts of the communities that maybe don't traditionally participate in these types of processes. There may be barriers, and where we can, we try and work through those to make sure we're reaching out to as much of the community as possible. And lastly, I just want to make sure we listen to residents. This really is a part of the plan for the city of Kenmore, for the residents who live here. So as our role in providing guidance and feedback and helping to develop these regulations and some of the comp plan policies. Want to make sure we're incorporating that feedback and understanding what the community is saying. So I think with that, Clay's going to kick us off on some just initial questions that we have at a high level to kind of get discussion going.
Just to kind of build off of Nick's comments on the engagement. I mean, I think that goal is that you've spent a lot of time talking about housing. Phase 1 did a lot of outreach to the community. I mean, I think the important thing is to, if we can provide some venues for people to be able to have more open discussion outside of public meetings and hearings where you have 3 minutes and it's a comment. If we can provide some opportunities to listen, it'll give somebody an opportunity to come during that time and have more robust conversations, one-on-one, ask questions. Sometimes maybe someone has a concern, but if you could just answer their question, then it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. So if we can do those kind of things, as much as we can do that to inform folks before we come to meetings and hearings as possible, it can also help shape the draft code that we put together. So hopefully it's in as good a shape as possible when we come for recommendations and then ultimately come to the council for public hearings. So, one of the things we weren't going to do tonight is get super deep in just the weeds of the legislation, but we're here to, answer any questions that you have. But there are some initial questions I think that could help. And of course, provide any feedback that you'd like to provide to us tonight, because it will help us kind of form up the process to help put together that framework for a code. It's really kind of an intricate code because it's going to touch all of these different sections. Unlike some where you're updating a use matrix or subdivision code, this is going to have little pieces, but it's really like the approach to code writing that's really important. So, what do you see as the project opportunities or issues the project team needs to consider? If you can share upfront anything that may assist and help guide the project team as new policy and code is developed. We'd love to understand how often you'd like to be provided project briefings or project memos. We can do that as well. Very much believe in the no surprises rule. I want to be able to come to both bodies and have you go like, yeah, this is what I kind of thought we'd see. There may be little pieces, but you knew the framework and direction. So how often can we make sure that you're informed? And then any additional feedback on the information presented today. So we're just here to answer any questions that you might have. I would turn it back over for.
Just one point of clarification on the project schedule slide, there was noted about the town hall meeting on the 15th, that this was prepared just prior to that decision being put on hold. So I just wanted for anybody that's watching that town hall is on an indefinite hold at this point. There may be one later, but just wanted to point that out.
Questions? Commissioner Doran?
So I have a question / comment about the tier 2 decision. I think we need to spend some time with that, just because historically what happened previously was there was a less comprehensive proposal that was put forward, and then a more comprehensive proposal came forward, and that caused community concern. And also because of the tier 2 piece, what I understand, I'm hearing this secondhand, but from Commerce, is that for the 2025 update, it only has to be responsive to the 2020 population estimate. And if you're not over 25,000 in that, then I believe it's only in the periodic review by 2029, or actually 6 months after that, that you would have to be compliant. So I just think we need a good rationale for community why we're picking tier 2, because I don't think it's as simple as we would have to come back and write it in a year if the deadline's actually 2030. So that's just one thing that I think is really important decision point.
And I'm not sure about the 2020 OFM. I mean, regardless, you're still under 25,000 now. So it probably would be, there's a 5-year compliance check-in and it would come up at that point. So that means you'd be writing it probably the year before that. And so it's just a small amount of time. So I know that Debbie and Todd may have some thoughts on that, but there's a lot to, the biggest difference is the 4 units near transit, or if one is affordable, but it goes into just writing code, implementation, all of that.
Commissioner Vanderline?
This may be out of scope, but I've been wondering about the impact of this new law that we have on our ACO ADU rules and regulations that we put together previously. I'm looking and thinking back, having been part of that process, we developed the ADU without having this direction that we now have in place. So I'm interested in knowing what the impact of implementing these rules could potentially have on our existing ADU regulations. And how do we balance those out? Maybe we're fine, but if we're going for a particular level of density and we have a goal for density, I want to make sure that we understand how these two combine to impact our neighborhoods. Specifically, and again, I may not have a deep enough knowledge of this yet, but I think about the definition of unit and lot. And an ADU is tied to what? A unit or a lot? If you have a small house, not a subdivided area, does it now have the same ability to add ADUs as it would in the past? How does this multiply? What is the impact does this have on our density? I'd like to have some discussion and understand that better.
So my understanding is that if you created lots under 1337, then you couldn't add the same amount of ADUs to each one of those lots. So there's not like this multiplier effect that goes on and on and on and on. One key difference between the two pieces of legislation, though, is under 1110, it's the requirement to be able to allow the subdivision of those parcels. So historically, an accessory dwelling unit would be there with the primary home, that they'd be owned together. There's probably nothing that would stop someone from creating a condominium, but now you can do a subdivision. And so it's not just, those are a few different challenges. I mean, it's even on the development side of running utilities and parking and mailboxes and all of the different things that come with that. So, but the code should complement each other. I mean, if ADUs are allowed and there's design standards or regulations for those, and then there's other housing types that are allowed, I don't think it would be that much different from how it is now. I think it's just more of, it's more, different types of units allowed on smaller lots. I mean, it's like everything kind of gets amplified a little bit because talking about, it's not 8,000 square foot lots or 6,000, it might be 2 or 3 or 4.
Councilor Lutz and then Councilor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. White. So you brought up a good point about there's a lot of intervening variables when it comes to where missing middle housing can actually go within the city, whether that be setbacks or critical area zoning overlays, whatever it might be. Is it possible that through this process to sort of get a better representation of what that might look like, whether that's a map or a visualization of where in the city are we actually talking about when we're discussing this new zoning or these new policies? Just because, saying that it's citywide, I think isn't quite accurate when, as you've said, it's really reduced in some areas. And so I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it may be fruitful to have a conversations about, and we could do some site plans kind of showing if you applied your bulk standards to you could take a anonymous lot in the city and you could say, here's your current bulk standards. And if you applied those to this, you couldn't develop it because you couldn't meet the rear setbacks. If it's 25 feet and the current home is 20 feet or 25 feet from the rear property line, you couldn't build something closer. So that would be an example of it's not more restrictive than the current code, but you may not be able to build because that current home. So but that opens up the conversation of how do you put your bulk standards together? Are you facilitating the development of new middle housing? Are you keeping the regulations as they are right now? So there is some conversations about approach on just general approach on how we write this that would be really helpful at some point so that we put those together, because we can definitely put those kind of site plans, just walk you through what something might look like. But then again, everything changes if you said rear setbacks for middle housing types don't have to meet the rear setbacks for an existing single family home. It could be reduced by 50% if you do X. Then that whole site plan would look a little different. So those will be good conversations to have.
Councilor Marshall.
Well, the environment is our number 2, preserving the environment is our number 2 city goal, I think. And then we all share the goal, I'm sure, of that same goal, and also keeping Kenmore livable. those are my main concerns also, that we just don't focus on building and developing, but see how we can balance out those goals. I don't think they need to be in conflict. And on a note of extreme praise right now, I had been neglectful in not having read through 11:30.
11:10.
11:10.
That, you get the
11:10.
winner.
See how neglectful? But 11:10, I hadn't read through it recently. I read through that tonight and I saw, by gosh, I had forgotten language about the quarter mile development. Do we remember who first, at least here in Kenmore, came up with that quarter mile? That was this planning commission. And I don't know what revisions or introductions or iterations the bill went through, but if somebody wasn't paying close attention to that rule in Olympia, you at least thought the same way that the law came out. And that is a point of, to me, a great pride and great thinking. And our staff can be proud of that, our whole city staff, everybody, the planning commission and the council and the citizens of Kenmore. I think it's amazing that we're thinking that far ahead, that it came to be state law. So that's important. I think that with that inspiration, on an inspirational note, we can't stop there. We've got to learn how we can balance, if we're going to have bigger city density, how we're going to have bigger city balance for the environment and for the basic infrastructure we need. So I want everybody's help on this, but I've boiled it down to what do we need to make it livable? Okay, if there's increased density and if people are going to be parking their cars along streets, we can't have our kids walking in the streets in the rain and the dark and the cold. We've got to have sidewalks. Big cities have sidewalks. How can we accomplish that? Through perhaps exploring the transportation impact fee, so that it's not just a requirement to develop on the frontage of the project, but perhaps exploring how we can see if there's a contribution to a neighborhood sidewalk impact. And then the other one is impervious surfaces. If we can at least explore encouraging or incentivizing the maximum use of the existing impervious surfaces. That may go a long way towards preserving trees and environment, and also towards protecting streams from runoff, since we spent so much money on preserving our salmon runs and infrastructure. And then, yeah, that third part, the quarter mile to transit and the walkability, I was all set to go to battle on that. It's like, by gosh, we already have that in the law. So that's a further inspiration. So those are my concerns.
And just to, I mean, there's trying to think outside the box a little bit. We don't have to do this the same way as other cities, and thinking about, I mean, when you talked about like incentivizing good practices, maybe there's a way to develop a code that would look at bulk standard requirements, and maybe there's more flexibility with some of the bulk standard requirements when you implement best practices. So it doesn't always have to be like always for units, but maybe there's flexibility in how and where you can build on lots. This is the kind of feedback that we need from all of you, because once you have to head in a certain direction as you're writing your code, and it's got all these little tentacles and pieces to it. So that's great. Hearing your kind of the concerns that you have and kind of what you kind of thinking about is really helpful.
Commissioner Durant.
Just looking at the first question about opportunities or issues, I think one set of opportunities and then a couple of different issues. I think for us, one thing that came up last time was just the transparency again of which areas would be impacted. And one thing that we know goes into that is the HOA CCRs. So if there's a way for us to get a view into where in Kenmore would not be able to be subject to these less restrictive regulations because of more restrictive HOA CCRs, that would be interesting. I say that having just discovered over the weekend that my CCRs don't allow anything other than single family homes. So there's probably work that would have to be done to work with homeowners associations to try and extend beyond this. But initially just having a sense of where are we talking about that would be impacted. The other thing that I saw as an issue last time around was confusion about this not being affordable housing. And I think, affordable housing means a variety of different things to different people. But I think being clear with folks around that and what really we're talking about housing choice here. We're talking, teachers, nurses, police officers, firemen, fire people being able to afford homes, afford to live in the communities where they're working, which is a different level. But the standards we need to work to, so design standards, etc., need to be real around the level of affordability that we can develop there. And I think sharing, as well as hearing feedback, sharing that information with community around what does affordable really mean for somebody who's even at 100% of AMI, what do they need? And I think that is the opportunity as well is to share that, because I think our community has come back strongly in surveys and said we want that. We want to be able to give our police officers the ability to live in the community they're working. We want to give our nurses and school teachers that ability as well. So landing that this is what this relates to. We're not just changing zoning for the sake of it. We're changing it because we want to enable those opportunities.
Great, and just to make sure it's clear for everybody, they're within the legislation, if there are CC&Rs within neighborhoods prior to the adoption of the legislation that restrict the housing, then they wouldn't be subject to those requirements. We'll have to see how easy that information is actually to come by. It's not always 100% accurate. I mean, I think you would know, just like another bulk regulation, if those, I mean, typically the city's not enforcing CC&R regulations, but you might inform someone that says, hey, before you submit your application, you might want to check with the homeowners association to see if you can actually build here. On the affordability, you're correct that the affordability only applies when you do 4 units, and one would have to be affordable, and then there's provisions there. And I think you're right that the term affordable gets used a lot, but it's not always defined to what it means. I think in this case, it may be providing more affordable housing choices. And the thought process is that if housing is built on supply and demand, it's not going to be one development. It's over a long period of time. If you can increase supply, then that can over time bring down housing costs a little bit. So, but yes, we'll work to be very clear when we're talking to the community about this.
I've got a couple of, Commissioner Olson.
Thank you. I guess I have a question about how this applies, as it can't be less restrictive for single family. So building off of the idea of limited hardscape or limited impervious surface areas, for instance, if we wanted to, say, work to reduce the amount of impervious surface area that would be added, I would assume that those policies would need to apply to single family homes as well as any type of missing middle housing, in order to ensure that we're not being more restrictive with missing middle than we would be with single family. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think part of our research will be, a lot of times when you have impervious surface maximums for parcels, a lot of times the existing home isn't actually utilizing all of that. I mean, it's usually a lower percentage than the overall lot. So there may be opportunities in the code to actually stay within what's allowed on the single family lot and still meet that impervious surface target. But if you want to incentivize it, maybe you incentivize the ability of using, pervious materials, or using other, for attached housing types where you're not increasing the actual, some housing types, if you're going up, you might not actually increase the footprint. I mean, it may just be increasing the number of units. So I think that there's some ways that we can look at that, but typically if you're not typically, if it's 40% or 35%, typically a home is not at that level. So, but what we hope to see is you may see more units in the same space.
And another question I had is something I've been interested in, is working to get communities more oriented towards the street, which I believe we already have standards for and guidance for. And it's something that I've seen with a few units where we'll have a townhome that's put in and a driveway, and then buildings are facing the driveway as opposed to facing the street. And I guess I'm not quite sure how that fits in to all of this, but if there's any ideas on how we can work to try and keep places more community focused and oriented towards the street, as opposed to more insular away from the street going forwards. I think I phrased that poorly. I'll see if I can figure what I'm getting at.
I think, yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard kind of a focus on walkability and maybe maybe just throwing out there a lowered front setback to be able to have buildings be closer to the street in certain scenarios, depending on the situation. Yeah, I think there are ways to look at the code and try and incentivize certain product types and the placement of where they are on lots, and how that builds the character and kind of that portion of the community when those lots come in. So I think as we look through different opportunities and revising the code to meet the requirements, if that is a focus of the community and something that comes out in the engagement and discussions like these, we can certainly keep that in mind. That's the kind of feedback we want to hear in terms of general direction.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, some of that could be built into the things that when you're looking at balance, privacy, so if you're looking at allowing buildings to be the same height or taller, or where they're located on a lot, so thinking about how simple design changes you could get the same type of housing, but maybe it would make people feel more comfortable. So if we can learn about what are the things, the root of things that people see as opportunities or have concerns about, hopefully we could, evolve the design standards to be, kind of focused on those.
And I just want to follow up to that point. I have heard community concerns about privacy, for instance, in this type of development. And while I personally don't have as many of those concerns, I think it is worth mentioning that that's going to be something that we should consider as we move forward.
Commissioner Banaszewski.
I think one of the things that Commissioner Olson is speaking to is an opportunity to create more people-oriented, walkable neighborhoods in Kenmore. And I think that is a huge opportunity here. A concern I have is that if we're only addressing the housing, that we're going to kind of fall short, because people need places to walk to in order to meet their daily needs. And I know that this bill is relevant just to housing types, but I feel like an important part is thinking about the corner store issue that we did visit as part of our docket last year. I know this isn't really a question for you, but it's a comment and a concern I have. My concern is that if we just simply build more different housing types into the same kind of pattern of development, that we're not really solving the problem, that we're just going to have more people in a space who need to get into their cars to meet their daily needs. So it's a challenge I think that we have in front of us as a community, is to figure out how to kind of like fully flesh out the opportunity to create more walkable communities.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like when you're very close to transit options, you can you can get to the bus, or you can get to some transportation, which can take you where you want to go. But when you get further away from those, and then you're also saying, let's limit parking. And then you're like saying, well, but those people, if they can't walk to transportation, then they need a car to get there. Some of it is, that's a real thing. Some of it is, in planning, we're looking towards the future. So we're not looking always at the things that are happening right now. We're trying to plan to be at the best place in the future. So, you're working on transportation choices at the same time you're looking at housing change that will happen over a long period of time. But that's really an important point that we want to make sure that we take a look at. And I know that as part of phase one, we did some mapping on some areas that could be for potential small commercial nodes.
I don't know if there'll be an opportunity to revisit that or not, but I think it would be a wonderful opportunity if we could. And then I also am hoping that in your early engagement, that there'll be some engagement with our DEIA Advisory Committee and our Climate Action Advisory Committee, so that they can be kind of looped into this conversation with their particular lenses on. That would be a great opportunity for community.
What group is that again? I'm sorry.
We have a DEIA committee,
okay.
and we have a Climate Action Advisory Committee. They're made up of residents. And then my last kind of opportunity or challenge is that I'm curious to know how all of this will play out in our R1 residential zones, because I have always viewed those as partially a way to help protect our Swamp Creek corridor. And I hear you saying that our critical areas ordinances will be protective. I do feel like those ordinances need to kind of catch up with the reality of what our natural ecosystems actually really need. So I feel like in some cases they aren't actually as protective as our systems need. And I'm curious about the more density there is in that corridor, the harder it will ever be to return it to a more natural state. So that's a kind of a challenge that I'm looking ahead and seeing.
A massive challenge, you know, I mean, I think, you know, all the time about our 4-county region is growing like 1.8 million people between 2017 and 2050. And, you know, there's been decisions not to expand urban growth areas to most extent. So then we're planning inwardly, and all of the challenges we'll talk about as part of this project are real issues. They're hard, they're really hard to talk through because we're changing, but it's also this, we're starting to see redevelopment and moving away from greenfield development. And what does that mean? And how do you do it in the best way that fits what all of you would like to see?
Yeah, and I will say that I am a strong believer in keeping urban sprawl, you know, from eating into our rural farmlands and our wild spaces and forests and such. But I do feel like we can't have a concrete urban growth area and a green space out there. I feel like a challenge and opportunity for us moving forward is to learn how to integrate ourselves better with the nature that we do have here and live with here.
I've got a couple questions, and then I've got Commissioner Vandeline and I'm just making notes for myself, and then Councilor Marshall. So I appreciate the presentation. After looking at the map a bit again and kind of thinking through what we did with phase 1 and you know how we could integrate that into, or at least some of the work that we did there with this 1110 work, I'm inclined to take a look at where we were when we were doing that first phase 1 work and look at you know, what was brought to us from the Planning Commission a year and a half ago, where we were talking about duplexes and triplexes within about a quarter mile of all transit stops. And then, you know, in order to meet 1110, allow 2 units everywhere that isn't close to a major transit stop, and then the zoning required by the major transit stop requirement. I also think that it would be foolish for us to not be planning for tier 2 at this point, because even if it is just a few years out, even if it was 2030 that we would have to make that change, it seems kind of silly to go through this work now in the middle of the housing crisis and plan for something smaller with less housing and wait for 5 years because the problem is just going to continue to get worse. So I would strongly encourage us to, and we'd be saddling a future council with and planning commission with a bunch of work that we could get knocked out right now and be ready for the next 50 years instead of 5 years, because the project a block away here is going to put us over 25,000 probably by itself. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I do have some questions around, you're talking about allowed versus permitted, and I don't know, that kind of raised some red flags for me or some alarms for me a little bit. Would we need to, if we're going to do this work, okay, so let's say that we allow a duplex in a neighborhood and, but the underlying zone, and they have, you know, 10,000 square feet, they have a fifth of an acre. It's an R6. So they don't have they don't have a third of an acre. They have less than a sixth of an acre. They already have a house there. Would we have to change the underlying density for them to actually build the duplex that we would be allowing under zoning?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking about this more of, I felt like the legislation is a little incongruent between the requirements for the kind of housing you have to permit and sometimes the housing types that are allowed. Like if you allowed a 6-plex was one of the housing choices, but the lot could only have 4, and one was affordable, then unless you had a much larger lot where it did meet the base density, then you might not be able to build that because you wouldn't meet the density. Just like today, in your code, there's a lot of things that are allowed, but you may not, if you don't meet all the bulk standard requirements, you may not permit it.
Right, but I mean, what is the point of allowing, 2 units per lot if the reality isn't that that's actually what can happen? I mean, it kind of feels like, we'd be doing something counter to the spirit of the bill if we're doing something like that knowingly.
I don't see that being the case for duplexes, or sometimes So like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, if you didn't have an existing home or you made that, those would be ones that you'd most likely build. If you want to do cottage housing, you could build cottage housing and but you might need a certain lot size. It's just making sure that it's clear that anytime you propose a use, you have to meet the code in order to build it. And because you have to allow 6 of the 9, there may be times where just because you allow it in a certain area, doesn't mean every lot could build it. There may be some where you would need a larger lot, or you might need more land to be able to do it, or something might be really encumbered by critical areas. So just I think the main thing is just making sure if you're talking, especially I think about 6plexes or 5plexes, that just sometimes people might jump to the conclusion that you're already allowed to do it. And it's like, you are, if you can meet the development regulations, like critical areas still apply, or all those other things. So just making that clear up front.
Okay, because I'd really like to make sure that when we are done with this, that our, zoning and kind of bulk standards and all of that actually align with what we're trying to allow happen. I don't want to, I would prefer not to see, I'd prefer for us not to get cute and hide the ball and do that sort of thing. Councilor Marshall brought up a great point about impervious surfaces, and I actually think that might be an argument for us taking a look at the amount of driveway that we require for all of our developments right now. I think we allow like 20 feet of driveway, or actually require 20 feet of driveway for every new development right now, for every new house. And that is a lot of impervious surface right now. And then I know this isn't directly tied to this particular issue, but since we're in the housing element and we have staff, and somebody brought up corner stores, which I think is something that we've been kind of talking around for a while. As we're looking at the housing element, I think it might be worth maybe designating some like small neighborhood nodes in areas that kind of make logical sense. I'm thinking, in the neighborhood right next to the high school, I'm thinking there's a couple places on 155th that make a lot of sense, 61st, 68th, 73rd. Like there's places where it would make sense to allow for a little bit more intense growth and a little bit more, maybe, a street level corner store sort of set up along with maybe some housing on top or something. Because I think if we want to get to the corner store sort of model, then you have to allow a little bit of extra stuff around it too. And I think that would be something for us to look at as we're dealing with the larger housing element. That's, just looking through my notes, that's everything. Commissioner Vandelin?
Yes. As a planning commission, as we've gone through revision of the comprehensive plan in many different iterations, like one of the things we become aware of is how interactive they've actually become, particularly as we look at things like increased density. You just get done with your housing development and all of a sudden you're doing economic development. Wait a minute. There's parts of economic development that are extremely influenced by what decisions you make on density and where you put that density. So one of the things I'd like in this discussion is thinking about how do our decisions about where and what type of middle housing we produce occurs where? Does it support our plans for downtown? Is it congruent with our plans for the transit district? If we cast into the future, maybe 10, 20 years, decisions we make about having duplexes here, what does that look like in terms of limiting our ability to have larger multifamily, more dense housing somewhere else? I think we have to put those things together, and we can't always have all of the answers day one, because this is obviously a situation that's in transition. And so we need to have some flexibility in the rules that we create today that are going to allow for those changes that would be in the future, but also support the strategic planning we have right now, particularly on the economic development side, particularly for downtown. Make sure we make smart decisions here that don't preclude what may be a smarter strategic decision 5, 10 years down the line.
Councilor Marshall?
Councilmember Olson reminded me of the impacts of whether something, that the law says you can't be more restrictive for middle than you can for single family. And if there's anything in here that seemed to implicate that, or anything that we're looking at, maybe we could take note of it and then say, all right, maybe this is a place where we can propose a change to single family so we can comply with the law.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Yeah, a couple of additional questions. 3 questions. So what is the affordability level to add that 4th unit? So that's one question. Do we have a date for the public open house forum, whatever we want to talk about, town hall? I'm not super comfortable with just letting it out there that it's postponed indefinitely. I mean, we need to have something like that. I feel pretty strongly about that. And then the 3rd question, so going back to the map and kind of where are we talking about? Most of the area within the 522 corridor, I believe, is already zoned fairly high density. So I guess one thing that would be helpful as you're doing the map is really honing in on what are the areas that, and other people have said this, that we're talking about changing. If we're only talking about the 522 corridor, I don't think it's very much, and we exclude HOA, covenants. I don't think we're talking about much if we, expand to Juanita Drive and 153rd, 155th. That's a different kettle of fish, but I think we need to be really clear about where we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think when we get that will help provide clarity, and they'll still be outside of those areas allowing for two units per lot. But it's less than the 4 unless you want to make things more permissive. On the affordability, the statute says to qualify for the additional units allowed under section 1, the applicant must commit to renting or selling the required number of units as affordable housing. The units must be retained as affordable for a term of at least 50 years, and the property must satisfy that commitment. And all required affordability and income eligibility conditions adopted by the local government under this chapter. City must require the applicant to record a covenant or deed restriction that ensures the continuing rental units subject to affordability requirements consistent with the conditions of the statute for a period of no less than 50 years. There's more. And I know that there's some work with some organizations to help facilitate the management of that, but there's another challenge there.
I guess concretely, are we talking about 80% AMI, 50%, what is the affordability level that's called out?
Yeah, it's maybe the affordability that's set by the local government. So it would be something that would take place as part of this process.
When the town hall, what's the other question?
We don't have a date set yet. We were originally thinking when there was the town hall scheduled in April that we could piggyback on that. That isn't. I don't know when that town hall will be rescheduled or if we need to schedule our own kind of town hall open house just for this one topic. So more to come on that.
Sorry, I think I may actually have a better answer for Councilmember Shrubnik here. I was flipping to the bill and there's a definition section and it says affordable housing means, it says for rental housing, 60% of the median household income adjusted for household size for the county. And it says for owner occupied housing, 80% of the median household income. Councilmember Sassen?
Thank you, Mayor, for clarifying. I just want to refer both to what Councilmember Lutz had said and then also what Councilmember Srebnick has said. As we lead up to the town hall, we have a community that has been quite sensitized to issues of housing, and there has been quite a lot of misunderstanding of terms and what affordability means and what deep affordability means and all of those things. So to that end, the NUSA board, the North Urban, are putting together a glossary of terms, and I would like to see us have that available and also a map of what areas we're talking about prior to a town hall so that we as a town are all talking about the same thing. I think that that's going to be very important for us moving forward. So I'm on that board, so I will look to have it available. I just want to make you aware of it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dorian?
While we're on the subject of affordability, actually coming back to something that Mayor Herbig brought up as well, I remember seeing somewhere in the commerce materials that it's going to be very difficult to make some of these developments pencil out at 60% affordable or 80%, but that there is guidance as really that's what sits on local municipalities is the design standards and the development regulations that we set to make it possible to pencil out. So I don't know what that means in detail, but that's something that I'd love to see is information about that as we move through. How can we actually hit, even if we're not hitting 60 and 80, but how can we make it affordable at the levels that we're hoping to?
If I could just kind of speak a little bit to that. So a regional coalition for housing, ARCH, is taking a look at affordability requirements and specifically taking a look at whether different scenarios would pencil out for affordability. So we're actually going to be sharing that information with what we're working on as well.
We can also, as part of the outreach, be reaching out. What are those triggers that help make things easier to build or harder to build? And from that perspective of making things pencil, but also the regulations and how they work on their end and that kind of stuff. So at least you have that perspective when you're evaluating code options.
Chair Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor. So when we're talking about affordability for buying homes, so I certainly probably would think that part of it is how much is the mortgage payment and what all of those kinds of factors are. And I'm sure that's part of what Debbie was talking about getting for us. But the other issue is when you say affordability, what about down payment? What is an affordable down payment or a 60% level? I don't know. And that's not like, you know, renting. So a lot of issues. I don't want an answer now, but I know I'm thinking this through. It's a difficult question, and it's not, when we discussed this at the Planning Commission last year, we were very concerned about how that was figured. And our general view is with the cost of housing in Kenmore generally, we just didn't see how this is going to pencil out. But maybe you have some ideas, and that's why we have you. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's more than just a mortgage payment. A lot of those people that are at 50%, they usually don't have a whole lot to put down on a piece of property. Then there's utilities and other upkeep too.
Commissioner Manasetsky.
Reflecting on,
You really talking to the mic.
yeah, I'm sorry. I have to pick it up. Reflecting on what Councilmember Lutsis and Sasan have said, I think reflecting on our past communities' responses to the idea of missing middle housing, I think it would be good, yes, to help everyone understand what we're talking about. And I think that will help with maps, will help with that, and definitions, but also visuals, I think can really help. So I know you have some examples in your presentation about what these different housing types look like. I think that'll be really important. And I think helping people see them in context too will be really important. I know there is a neighborhood that is filled with these missing middle housing types in Bothell, not very far away from us. So we, you know, some community tours could be organized there so that people can see them in context. I think that will really help people understand what it could look like in our community as well. And there may even be some middle housing types hiding in our community in plain sight, and maybe those could be good examples for us as well.
I think that's a great point. And we're intentionally going to try and cycle our imagery because we don't want anyone to get stuck on any one image of like, that's exactly what it's going to look like. It can take a lot of different forms and architectural styles and things like that. So yeah, it's a great point that walking tours and that kind of context, being able to see it in person is a really powerful tool as well.
Councilor Sassen.
that is one request that has come from our community, which is to identify how many of this type of unit we already have. And so perhaps there can be a map where we're already identifying, because in my neighborhood, we have handfuls of duplexes that are tucked in. And I think that those folks who don't walk the neighborhood don't even know they're there.
Commissioner Olson?
Yes, to Commissioner Sassen's point about locations that we already have it, I would also be interested in showing, or trying to show the process of what it would take today versus what it would take under new guidance to have that housing type. Because I think that's one thing that is interesting to me oftentimes is today, you might need a variance. You might need to go through an extra set of red tape or bureaucracy to make something happen that this might help with. And then another thing that I wanted to mention is I've also heard some passion for cottage housing as a particularly popular option. However, growing up in a place that's kind of cottage housing to some degree, there's some challenges with it, particularly lot size and the amount of space that it requires to make a successful cottage housing community. So I would also be interested in what types of approaches we could take to make that type of project more feasible. And if there's any locations in Kenmore that, and this might be out of scope, so I'll correct me if I'm wrong there, or but what types of locations might be able to fit that type of housing? And what types of policies or codes would be helpful in making that type of housing possible?
We did discuss that a bit as part of the phase one of just kind of the push and pull of cottage housing of if you build smaller homes, but you still have all the parking, then it may not pencil very well. You know, there could be ways if you really wanted to see cottage that you would really incentivize it to try to get higher densities that, you know, versus maybe the underlying zoning. But there's some push and pull on that because they'll show my personal view. Sometimes you see the pretty pictures of cottage housing, but without reduced parking, you don't see the parking lot that's behind it. So, I mean, you got to find some way that the design standards all work so it'll actually pencil so that you can build it. So if it's something you're interested in, we could just have that conversation of what that might look like if you wanted to. I think to the mayor's point of wanting to not just have code that sounds good, but have it actually work well. And so we can certainly have that conversation.
Commissioner Wyckoff?
My concern right now is how do we protect the current parking needs for the community of Kenmore, but how do we also look to the future to try to accommodate the new requirements that are coming, or the new restrictions is a better way of putting it. And I'm all for that, but I'm also concerned, for instance, in the Todd, as density goes up and affordable housing, parking becomes more expensive and it becomes no longer feasible. But by going that direction, when we're talking multi-use, if we go along with the limited or almost obsolete parking opportunities, we've now excluded anyone who doesn't live within the quarter-mile walking distance because the rest of Kenmore still requires a car. I mean, we can go around the table. We're within a quarter mile of the 522 right now. How many people took transit here tonight to this meeting? It's real handy if you live on 522. It's really not handy if you don't right now. And it's not going to be any time in the real near future where I can't even walk a sidewalk to get to rapid transit from where I live. So it's just not feasible. I don't have an answer. I don't have an agenda. I'm just saying, I think this is important to all of Kenmore. We all understand. I've heard from people that live in both areas, their concerns, and from the people living in apartments already that are facing restricted parking and have to get up at 5 in the morning to move their car, or have to move their car every 2 hours to comply with the spot that they're forced to utilize right now. As it turns out, the people that are living in apartments don't always have the most money to be having a new line item, which is monthly parking tickets. And I'm finding that this is a realistic line item that they're dealing with in their monthly finances. And it doesn't seem to be solved. These people also need to go to jobs, wherever those jobs may be, which may not be lined up with the infrastructure. So they've got to get the money wherever the money's at, and it's not lining up with bus routes. So just the parking thing is a sensitive issue, and it's not going to be a one size fits all, but I'm going to be looking for as much flexibility in there so that it stays logical. We just can't let something fly through because someone required it. It's got to be logical for the community.
Mr. Vanderland?
Yes, I want to go circle back to the MGI percentages for affordable housing. Glad to see it in the bill. I think it's very instructive. But I think one of the things that communities have learned is that in lieu of payments can also provide some flexibility that you don't necessarily get, and developers may prefer that give us additional funding to use in a more flexible way. So I know within the bill, it allows you to come up with alternatives that are the equivalent. So I'm wondering if we could have a policy discussion on that. Could we add, or how would we add, or want to add, or use in lieu of payment? It's a way to incentivize affordable housing, but give us a flexibility to be able to use those dollars in a way that it would actually be more realistic in terms of what's truly available in the community.
Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Shrevenick?
There, this kind of takes off on Councilmember Sassen's comment a little bit. I think there's, certainly an interest in the community for small detached homes. And I'm curious how this relates to the other topic that is not technically middle housing, but it's small houses on small lots that will come shortly thereafter. If the lots become smaller, but we're still allowing duplexes and potentially up to 4, well, I mean, I guess that's a question. I guess it's more of a comment. I just want to make sure we're thinking about those two things in tandem. They're not in isolation. And then my question is, where does the conversation fit about kind of the look and feel of them? I know that we've had some discussion of having the multiple units kind of fit on a similar footprint and kind of look like a single family house, if that makes sense. And is that this conversation? Is that a further down the road conversation? I'm just curious where that fits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will be further down the road, but I think it's gonna be, it won't be too far down the road because, I mean, we're gonna have to have a conversation about all of the things that you brought up because they're all pretty tough topics. I mean, how do you're balancing providing more housing, but you're wanting the feel of a community and you're wanting to, I mean, all of these different things, it's all like pulling levers. And so you pull something over here and it's gonna impact somebody over here positively or, they're perceived negatively. We're gonna have to try to work and find that sweet spot. But I'm under an illusion that we can write you a code where everybody's gonna be like, wow, that was it. So I mean, parking challenges and how do we get that? So I think from what I've heard from council tonight, I mean, what's going through my head is when we're having this community conversation, that we can set up some stations where we can show some like lot mock-ups, or we can go through like the park, have a parking station, we can go through some of these and at least walk people through this. I mean, I think we really want to make sure people are informed. We're not going to change their mind always, but at least they understand the topics. The other thing we had discussed with the team is trying to get ahead of frequently asked questions of just that people don't jump to conclusions about what this is and what it isn't. So that at least they're not starting from that point of misunderstanding this, because there's already enough to have to get your arms around. So work hard to get that information out about where it would apply and where it doesn't. And I mean, all of these different kind of baseline things, and then we can have the conversation from there.
And I think just real quick, some of that look and feel does apply to the development standards and how those are written. And so some of it does come from that. Some of maybe architectural standards and stuff like that is a little bit separate and maybe a little bit further down the road. But certainly how those development standards get addressed and developed can impact some of that look and feel that I think you're talking about.
Because the thing is, like, is the design standards a trade-off for height or for setbacks or for other, where windows are placed, so for privacy, but that allows you to get this over here. So I think we need to just provide you enough options where you can give us the direction as we go forward, and then we can kind of craft something that looks kind of like that, and then we can massage it as we go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, when we were discussing this, during phase one, a lot of what we were discussing was essentially allowing people to use the same general envelope that a single family house would, everything we're discussing here is stuff that would likely only happen with either, a new lot that is vacant or a tear down house at this point. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And, we were discussing essentially keeping things in the same envelope as a new single family house. So, the options are either a 3,000 square foot box that sells for 1.5 to 1.8 million, or possibly allowing the same 3,000 square foot box to have three, $750,000 flats. And, that gets to some of the questions and concerns that people raise around, affordable housing. And I think, again, I don't want us to be conflating affordable housing with more attainable housing or with more market rate housing, because frankly, we need all of it. We need both affordable housing, that we're working on with Imagine Housing, where we're subsidizing things and we're making it affordable for people who, at the 50% rate, but we also need just more market rate housing. That is a huge reason why we are in the housing crisis we're in right now. Washington State is the least housed state in the country, and supply and demand does not ignore the real estate market. Even if the real estate market is a little different than some other markets, supply and demand is still a huge part of that. And so we need to allow more market rate housing if we want to see this, housing market correct itself. So, I personally don't have a problem that these won't be affordable per se, because we need more market rate housing anyway. Anyway, any further? Chair Thompson?
On the lighter side, I can see Commissioner Wire bringing up golf carts again. But one thing that I think that should happen whenever we have a public town hall or anything related to this is a little entrance checklist to see how many people actually took transit to the meeting, and how many, and the correlation to those who live in the, shall we call it, the 522 corridor, and those who don't. Because I think that the question that just came to me, because the question is how many people here tonight took transit to get here. And that was actually, it brings out the point. I mean, if what's going to do, so that's one way to do it. And we're all going to have some daytime town halls, I'm sure. So just a thought.
Any further questions or comments? Commissioner Olson?
Yeah, on the whole topic of parking and modes of travel, one thing that I think is important to consider.
Could you bring the mic closer?
Yeah, I can do that. No worries. So one thing I wanted to ask about, or perhaps consider as we move forward, is connectivity and how that is considered currently with single family homes versus missing middle. I ideally, I think they should apply to both. But if we are increasing density, connectivity matters a lot. What could be a quarter-mile trip, depending on how connected the street layout is, could be preclusive to walking or biking or another mode of travel. So that's something, golf carts, for instance, we should consider. And I think, to me, that's something that perhaps could influence how we consider parking requirements, for instance. Are you feasibly able to get to a corner store or a potential future corner store from a lot or not? And if not, to me, that fundamentally changes the way you might want to build something. That being said, I'm not wedded to that idea, just something I'm spitting out there at the moment.
Other questions or comments? Last call. All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I know we gave you a lot to think about, so thank you for that. We are going to take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 8:46. We'll be coming back to the tables, yeah. Everyone can take their seats. Thank you. Go ahead. Team McGrath. I think we'll do. All right, the Kenmore City Council is back from recess. Next on the agenda is proposed ordinance 23-0597 Tier 2 tree regulations presented by Development Services Director Samantha Loyuk and Assistant to the City Manager Garrett Oppenheim for discussion.
Correct. Good evening. So in December 2023, we held a second public hearing to discuss the Tier 2 tree regs. At that time, council, you advised us to go back and get community input. And so we've done that. You can see in the agenda item as well as the attachments. We'll step through those in a bit, but there are copies of all the comments as well as an Excel spreadsheet that breaks down each of those. The feedback received varied from pointed and clear code language changes. For example, changes to soil amendment requirements in the landscape chapter to more complex issues such as impact on housing. Comments were provided for Tier 2 tree regs as well as exceptional tree, the already adopted exceptional tree ordinance. So Garrett will go through kind of what we have and how we'll get through the items.
Thank you, Samantha. So in the materials that were in the packet, you can see that attachment 1 is an Excel spreadsheet. In there, we compiled all of the different comments that we received, the written comments. And then those are also provided as attachment 2, where you just get a copy of each of the comments. So those are in 2 forms where you can find them. Attachment 5 is the most recent version of the amended code where we have gone through and included the comments so that you can see them in context. And at the end, there are the ones that didn't really directly relate to any particular section of the code. So they're just off separate, but just everyone can know that we did review all of these things. And hopefully, if there are no objections, we can just go through attachment 5, item by item. Okay.
And we can bring that up here if you'd like to see attachment 5. Okay. And we can go through these in whatever order you want, but this was the way that we took all the comments and plugged them in and then provided our feedback and then also requesting your feedback.
So Sarah, just to clarify, are you saying that attachment 5 folds in some of the changes and from the public comments that we've received?
Correct. So at points throughout the code in attachment 5, there's like a blue box that will say, here's a change that was requested by Jim Howard. And then there's a staff comment on that recommendation.
Thank you.
Do you want to get started on the first?
Yeah, so the first one is in section 1525.030, subitem K, exceptional trees. You can see on the second page in the blue box, it's the proposal, and then in the orange box, it's the staff recommendation. So this proposed change was from resident Jim Howard. He wanted, this deals with the exceptional tree ordinance. He wanted to change the definition of an exceptional tree and update it to replace the 48-inch DBH diameter breast height to make that smaller, either 24 or 30 inches. The reason was that there are no non-native trees in Kenmore larger than 48 inches, so a smaller DBH would be appropriate for non-native trees. And as you can see in the orange box, the staff recommendation is that the exceptional tree ordinance was recently adopted, and based on feedback from the development community, including anticipated negative impacts to density, the staff does not recommend changing the definition to include smaller trees. Sorry about that.
Yeah, if we could show it up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Sherman?
Are you asking for feedback? I mean, what's the process here? I just want to move us along.
Yeah, so we're asking for your feedback. We're going through these as attachment 5, but we don't have to go through each one of them if you would prefer a different way. We have the spreadsheet, but we can just keep moving. Maybe when we get to ones that require like specific direction from council, but feel free to stop us at any time if there is one that you want to talk about.
Sounds fair.
Okay, so the next one is 15-25-070, and it's a comment from Master Builders, and it's recommending retaining the existing tree, the yearly allowance for tree removal. And this was one item that says we asked council to provide feedback.
Councilor Sherman?
Just as context here, so confirm that this is applying to regular residential homes existing, not new developments, right? So this particular piece.
Correct.
Okay, and so we used to have different amounts of trees for different property sizes. Now we're proposing here to go to a single standard for all property sizes, right? Okay.
Correct.
So I mean, as I've mentioned before, I mean, I think the main issues that we're hearing from our community have to do with new development, large scale new development, and less about this kind of thing. I mean, personally don't have any problem with setting a single standard. That seems to make sense in my mind. But although if you've got a very large property, you have many, many, many more trees probably. So it is a little odd. It does to me seem overly restrictive to go to one. But that's just my personal opinion. Having gone through this many times on our own property, each permit, each time you have a arborist come out, I mean, it's a thing to think you're going to have to do that for every single tree, one at a time, when you know that you've got multiple that need dealing with. It's very burdensome.
To respond to that, there are codes that are used in other jurisdictions that would have like a rolling 36-month period so that it stretches it out a little bit more instead of saying one per year. You could do the same thing and say, 3 trees per 36 months, because typically when people are doing that, they're not doing one at a time. So that's an option as you think about maybe ways to change it. But also I wanted to point out that part of this comment did mention the challenges of developing an ADU.
I mean, in general, I think we need to, I mean, we've already talked about this a little in the previous session, balance trees and environment issues with development. I mean, that's always a tension that we're dealing with. So, and this is no exception. I would love to be able to explore a way that we either provide exemptions or softening of the regulation if the purpose of the tree removal is ADUs or other housing units. I mean, that also meets a council and community goal. So I guess I'd like to explore that further before making a final decision on this.
Counselor Marshall?
Yeah, I favor the limit to one per year, but I am persuaded by Councilmember Shrevenick asking us to look at more options for it, see if we can balance it. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I share, I mean, just reading through some of the comments, I share Councilmember Shrevenick's concerns around, somebody's ability to build an ADU in their backyard, or, there was one example, I think, where somebody could build 17 houses, but they can only build, I think it was 2. And that is, I think, kind of an unforeseen consequence that I think we probably need to take a harder look at, because there is a balance between these two things. I also think that if we're going to look at, I think limiting the number of trees that somebody can cut per lot, kind of as Councilmember Shrevenick was alluding to, it can be a little unfair for some folks who have larger lots. And I think it might be worth looking at either kind of the rolling kind of calendar that you were talking about, or, limiting the number of trees that can be cut based on some amount of square footage. Somebody has a big lot, they may have a totally, legitimate reason why they need to take down more than one tree. And making somebody stretch that out over multiple years doesn't do, it doesn't change the outcome in the long term, and all it does is just drag things out and probably make, if they're building an ADU or something else, it makes it much more expensive in the long run. And I don't think that's kind of what we're trying to get at, because we'll still get to the same level of tree coverage, but we'll end up with more expensive housing, which I don't think anybody's looking for. And I do think that if somebody is trying to build an ADU in their backyard, we do need to make sure that there's a path for somebody to do that, regardless of the tree requirements, because there needs to be some flexibility there. Just because somebody has been a steward of a tree for a few decades shouldn't preclude them from adding a DADU if they want down the line. So I think that's something that we need to think about a little bit further. Any other comments before we move to the next one?
Find the next one, please.
It looks like the next one is in the landscape chapter. 1835-030. Oh, you have it up there.
So this one came from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Here, I'll scroll up so we can get the context of this a little bit. They don't recommend adding code language to allow tree removal for the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property rights or use possessed by other similarly situated properties, but which, because of the presence of significant trees, is denied to the subject property. The reason for this is that the addition of this policy could lead to an overuse of the exception and have a negative impact on ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. They say if the code language remains, tighter additional language may be warranted to further limit the use of the item. For example, maximum percentages could be included, such as square footage of the lot, that would dictate the percentage of trees to be removed. Mitigations requirements should be clearly outlined so that there's no net loss, and a possible reduction in impervious surfaces to offset tree removal could be required. And the staff recommendation here is to get some discussion.
Comments? Councilor Marshall?
I'm inclined to be aligned with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, because we're trying to make this consistent for the purpose of preserving trees. However, if there's more study that can be done based on a more individualized look at different properties based on some of the things you mentioned, I'm not against considering that.
Councilor Lutz?
Just following up on that, I think it might be worth it to further refine what sort of substantial property rights or uses might be included within there. Right now, it's very broad and vague, but I can see situations in which people use trees to regulate natural heating and cooling of their property, their house and everything like that, which, that might be something to look into, or effectively maintaining trees for other property value and things like that in a certain way. So maybe exploring that a little bit more. But I think as of right now, it might be a little too vague, too broad. But also I can see situations in which it could be detrimental to take out the code completely.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Just going to be fully transparent here. I think Samantha knows what I might say. You know, we have a lot of hills here and we have a lot of beautiful areas. And so there's a lot of views and trees grow and they block views. And we love trees. And they're beautiful too. But, you know, again, full transparency, you know, we've planted many trees on our property, as did the owners of the house before us. Trees grow up, you don't realize how big they are, and all of a sudden they're blocking your view. And your view is part of your property value, significant property value. And I know I'm not alone in this. So I don't have a good answer. But I do think we need to recognize, you know, particularly if we're requiring a replacement, that, you know, sometimes property owners are going to want to remove trees to preserve, not to add value, but literally to preserve their home. You know, it's tough for me to say because I also really value the environmental aspect of trees, but I think if you're requiring replacement, that may fill the bill there. And, you know, I would like to see us recognize views as a real thing in our community, because it does add to the beauty of the community, and it certainly is important to homes that have views.
Any further discussion? All right.
Okay, the next item is also in the landscape chapter, 1835-080. From Jim Howard. He provided some information on planting depth, and we reviewed those comments and took no exception to those. I think that those could pretty easily be included in the landscape chapter. So we'll, unless there's any question on those, we could move on to the next. Oh.
Councilor Lisses?
Just a question. Who on city staff will be checking the depth of the soil?
So it would be on the landscape plans that are prepared by a landscape architect. And there's an inspection portion, but it's not the city staff that are out there measuring it. There's an as-built that's provided by the landscape architect prior to city staff signing off that essentially says, we built it per plan. And then city staff will go out and verify and count plantings and things like that. But essentially, we're relying on their landscape architect to comply with the plans.
Thank you. I'm not saying I disagree with this. I'm just kind of curious when you get into the minutia of how deep the soil is and everything, how that's enforced by the city. Thank you.
Councilor Sassen?
If I'm reading this correctly, this is all new landscape areas proposed for a development site. This isn't individual homeowners planting a new tree, which frankly I do on the regular. This is for a new development site.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
That answered my question also. Any further discussion? All right.
The next one is in the same section. And this is also from Jim Howard. He said he recommends that the city update the landscape code to a comprehensive landscape sustainability standard such as that defined by the city of Bellevue in their code. And the reason for this, he says, soil is an essential component of healthy plant growth and stormwater management. These are critical components of the city's climate action plan. Soil ensures healthy long-term plant growth and also helps reduce stormwater runoff and improves water quality. And then you can see the staff recommendation is that revising the landscape chapter to model The City of Bellevue Sustainability Standards and Best Practices Manual would require an overhaul and rewrite of the landscape chapter, and this is outside the scope of this project. It could be considered as a future docket item. However, minor changes for purposes of tree preservation could be incorporated as they are consistent with the purpose of the Tier 2 tree regs. So staff supports two changes. One is requiring landscape plans to include the minimum 24-inch depth soil preparation, and second is to include a standard soil detail for soil preparation.
Question? I support the staff recommendation. I think it makes a lot of sense. Not seeing any other hands coming up, so I think we can.
Okay, the next comment, it's also in this section of landscaping.
Councilmember Sassen, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to point out that while views are important and trees are important for shade and, you know, temperature regulation, we really do have a significant runoff issue as we are above the lake. And soil erosion and healthy roots do matter. As much as the tree canopy matters, so also does retention of our steep hillsides and the capacity for runoff. So piece of discussion, I just wanted to make sure that was said. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next item was also from Jim Howard, and he's saying that one of the items should be changed to say that ground cover shall be planted and spaced, and that the total coverage of landscaped area should be within 3 years instead of a majority. So he said that the current code said there was a 55% ground coverage required within 3 years. I didn't find that in the code. So I'll follow up with him to see where he got that from, because typically we have, for landscape plans, we have performance standards where they say the first year you have to be at 100%. And then typically by the time you get to the third year, it's 80 to 90% survival. And so we attach a bond or a financial guarantee to that. And that seems to have been working okay. So we'll follow up with him, but other than that, I wouldn't change it.
Any discussion?
Okay, the next one is in landscape maintenance. He wants to add, Jim Howard provided a comment saying that he would like to add a sentence that says the property owner must replace any unhealthy or dead plant materials in conformance with the approved landscape development proposal and shall maintain the landscape material. The code language comes from City of Bellevue. And so the intent that's already provided in the landscape chapter is consistent with this recommendation. So it does say that landscaping has to be maintained. It just doesn't have this very specific language. So staff's recommendation was to leave it as is and not change the wording.
Any discussion? Councilor Marshall.
Question, then, is there a difference then in what actually happens with monitoring the compliance and effectuating the compliance from that language? Would you see a difference?
So for how it works with developments is when we're in the monitoring period where there's still a bond attached to it, we will go inspect the property when the bond is active. When it's not, when it's released, it becomes the responsibility of the property owner. It's not a big code violation that we go out for. If we do get a call about something, pretty rare for residential, but maybe a business or something, we would send a reminder and point them back to the code that they're supposed to maintain it for the life of the project.
How long are the bonds?
Landscape bonds are 3 years.
Other comments? All right. Oh, Councilmember Sassen, sorry.
Again, this is a process question. I'm wondering if it's appropriate to put these comments, the comments and also the staff recommendations to our Climate Action Committee. I feel, although I'm a gardener, I feel qualified to weigh in significantly on this. And I'm just wondering if there might be good use of our Climate Action Committee to mitigate this at all. The question for consideration.
Or, okay, and this is very similar to the other one, actually. Well, it's related to the financial guarantee. So we received a comment from Master Builders saying that the 3-year financial guarantee should be eliminated. And then instead, a covenant should be required to be recorded. We do recognize that the 3-year financial guarantee can be challenging, especially for residential lots where an approved landscape plan is on file and then all the lots have sold. And now it's the property owner who may want to maintain their yard, but the developer has a bond or financial guarantee that's linked to the trees and landscaping that's there that's now no longer owned by them. So we do recognize that that is a challenge. And this is something that we could look at.
Councilor Marshall?
I'm not opposed to seeing what you would look at. I just would want to look at what is most effective in incentivizing to keep these things maintained. I think the financial responsibility would be very persuasive.
Any other comments? All right.
We're making good progress. We're in 1857 now. Okay.
Page 35 out of 58. We're scooting.
We're speeding, yeah. Okay, the next comment was from Jim Howard. This is in 1857-050. Add item F that states provide recommendations for post-construction maintenance to ensure long-term survival. It's just a recommendation that would be provided by the arborist as part of the arborist report. Staff take no exception to adding this.
Questions, comments? Not seeing anybody.
Okay,
So-
next section is 1857-060 is from Master Builders saying we recommend retaining the current tree density requirement. So one of the changes of tier 2 was to increase the tree density requirement from 30 tree units per net buildable acre to 40. And so this is one where staff requested discussion by council.
Discussion. Comments? Councilor Marshall?
I support the increase in terms of protecting our environment.
Any other comments? Councilmember Shrubnik?
Well, I think this is another one where we, like we said before, might want to look at unintended consequences to housing development. I'd like to go with the increase if we can. But I think we need to understand what the impact is.
Yeah, Councilmember Lucas?
I was gonna say, I agree with Councilmember Shrubnik. I think it might be useful to look into this a little bit deeper. I think we're all on the same page when it comes to, we're all advocates for preserving our trees, but we should have a better picture, a broader scope of what the impacts could be.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Lucas and Shrubnik. And also, seeing in our latest canopy report that the canopy is growing a little bit. I'm a little less worried about requiring additional tree units. So I think it's worth making sure that we're not running up against unintended consequences here also.
Thank you. The next section is, well, it's still this section. It's a comment from Master Builders. So it's talking about Kirkland's new tree code and saying that Kenmore could add similar language. So it says, unless retention of trees would, and then there are some exceptions in here that say reduce lot density, number of lots, maximum FAR, or lot coverage, or preclude construction of ADUs, or preclude required access and utility connections. So this recommendation is requesting to add some flexibility to the code section.
Comments? I mean, I think this gets to a lot of what we were discussing earlier around, especially ADUs, but shows some of the other externalities. And actually goes to our previous conversation a little bit about missing middle too. But I think this is probably worth examining a little bit. Councilor Lucis.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mr. Mayor, that we want to make sure that we fully realize the impacts of the current policy. And so maybe taking another look at this and what it means when it comes to the development of ADUs, or balancing that with missing middle housing or other potentially unforeseen consequences.
Says here that the city attorney may have feedback on the presidential value of the settlement. Do you have any comment there, the attorney?
Superior, excuse me, that was so loud. Superior Court is persuasive, non-binding, however, still a court case.
Thank you. Any further comments? All right.
The next item is similar in nature, and it's from Master Builders. And it's referencing 1857-063, where it says that no variance is allowed in order to create additional lots. This is specific to the exceptional tree code, which is separate from the Tier 2 and recently adopted. And so similarly, we heard what you just said about the previous comment about development and looking into unintended consequences and worth examining. Is this the same thing for exceptional trees? Yes, I'm seeing nodding of heads. Okay. I figured that. I didn't want to assume. Okay.
Any additional comments on this one? All right.
Okay, the next comment is also from Master Builders, 1857-063, should be amended to allow the removal of exceptional trees and so that they can be replaced, so the tree canopy can be replaced. So to update that language. It says currently the mitigation requirement is 3-to-1, which is substantially more and burdensome. However, the 3-to-1 ratio is actually for critical areas and buffers, so that's in a different code section. So we can look at this one also in the context of everything that we're talking about. Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay.
Councilor Shrubnik.
Yeah, and just a little caveat on that. I mean, I think the Fish and Wildlife comment about, no net loss of ecosystem value is critical. I mean, it's not just, as Councilmember Sassen said, it's not just about canopy, although canopy is key, but about, groundwater erosion, I mean, the whole thing. So I was struck by how different jurisdictions deal with this. And, a small minority talk about density in terms of tree units. There's many other ways, and I feel like we've gone down the road pretty far on this one direction, but it would be, I guess it would be helpful if it's feasible to examine maybe other approaches to tree, conceptual approaches like other cities are doing around tree canopy, you know, what, it kind of gets fundamentally to what are we trying to accomplish?
Right.
I mean, there's both ecosystem value and beauty. So well, and obviously housing as well, but I'm on the environmental side. I don't know, I'm not qualified to really even know what are the best approaches to getting to those goals. So, yeah.
Definitely a careful balance. And I think that a lot of jurisdictions are talking about this right now. We all seem to do it a little different, but if you start in the beginning code sections of each one where it says intent and purpose, we're all saying the same thing, right? So we're doing it different. King County is doing a study right now that I've been following. So I'm hoping to get information from the research that they've already invested in and incorporate that into what we bring back for discussion to council. So that is happening right now. Okay, next one.
Councilmember Sassen?
As there are so many moving pieces and we're reviewing all of this, I do want to say I feel sensitive to building projects that are already in process of trying to seek permitting and you trying to permit those things. So I want to be sensitive to the pressure cooker that feels like to me to try and fill that gap. So we'll just look to you for guidance about reviewing this soon.
Yeah, there are a few different issues that are raised here in the public comments that we received. One is for development that's been proposed, right? So some of these rules like exceptional trees have already been adopted and we're implementing them. So as we, look to you guys for advice, we would need to know what changes you would want to be made to exceptional tree regs. If there's a sooner option or if this is part of a longer study of the tree code. But yeah, I think it's important to realize we do have projects that are still going on, and they're under these existing regs.
I do feel particularly sensitive about the exceptional trees. I think we back.
The measure?
Council Member Shrevenick's question about how other cities approach it. Samantha and I were just earlier having that conversation about how she would love to carve out some time where she can take the best of each city code and put it into ours. So that sounds like a great idea. What's challenging is really setting aside the time for Samantha to be able to do that. So I think that's what we'd like to do.
Yeah, as I was going through the different codes and I got the question from Councilmember Shrevenick about other jurisdictions, I was going through and reading them. I was like, I like that. I like that. And it all makes sense. And we are trying to accomplish the same thing, right? All of these jurisdictions, we want to strike a balance between, trees, which are so important, and housing. So that may be part of a larger study that maybe we're coordinating with Community Development Department and their work on housing. Go to the next one.
Yeah, so the next one is in the variance section of the exceptional tree ordinance. I think this one was just an oversight when it was originally written. Fish and Wildlife pointed out, they said that they would like us to require mitigation for private access in the same way that we do for hazardous trees. So if you look in here, for hazardous trees, they have to be replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio, but then for private access, there was no mitigation. So I think we would just add a subsection C that puts in the same requirement. And we take no exception to that recommendation, so.
Councilor Lutzis?
Yeah, I support that. I think that's a great idea, especially keeping it consistent between both of those sections.
Other comments? All right.
Okay, the next section, the next comment is from Master Builders, and that is part of 1857-080, specifically related to the fee in lieu system. So there was a fee in lieu proposed for instances where on-site replacement was not possible. This is used in other jurisdictions, and Master Builders requested more information or a defined term of infeasibility, so that there's some predictability in that determination. But yet to clarify, it's not intended to just deposit, a fee in lieu and not do the replacement. It's really for unique circumstances, where you just can't fit replacement trees or the number of replacement trees that may be required. So this would be, we would look at this in the context of the larger code amendments. Sounds like that's where a lot of these are going, but let's keep going.
Discussion? Does this apply, is this only for significant trees or does this also apply to exceptional trees? The fee in lieu?
I don't think the fee in lieu was intended for exceptional trees, but I can look at that a little closer.
Councilor Lucis?
Yeah, I think the definition you gave for infeasibility makes it a lot clearer for myself at least. So I think I'd be in favor of maybe flushing that out a little bit more. I think having more clarification is certainly always better than less.
Other comments on this one? All right.
So the next one is also from Master Builders. And this was, they were recommending modifying the financial guarantees section. They said that the 3-year financial guarantees raise significant concerns for home builders. We kind of talked about this one.
We
This
did,
is
yeah.
along the
it's-
same lines as the previous
Yeah.
one,
Right,
right? Or as the previous
yeah.
one. Yeah.
Next one.
Actions to go into the next one?
Oh, actually, that is the last of the ones that were part of the tree code. So this next one is Patrick O'Brien had a concern. He said that he owns the trees on his property and he wants to remove them and replant them somewhere else if he were to move out of Kenmore. He wanted to know if this is considered a tree removal. He says it shouldn't be, that it would be a Fifth Amendment taking. And yes, so we were hoping that you would discuss that issue.
Councilor Marshall?
Well, it seems at some point it might be an executive session or legal issue.
Councilor Lucis?
This is just my take on this, but if a tree is transplanted and it survives, it hasn't reduced the tree canopy. I know that's something that we've been considering when it comes to preserving and increasing the tree canopy. But
Councilor Marshall?
Also, this is a particular question rather than a code change.
Yeah, this seems like, this isn't a code change request as far as I can tell. It seems more of a legal question.
is it like clarified anywhere that transplanting trees is acceptable within the code?
No, we don't have that currently in the code. It says if you're removing it, then it's considered a removal.
Okay.
I mean, could we differentiate between like removal versus, cutting down and chipping a tree? I mean, could we differentiate between those two things? If somebody's taking the root ball and is preserving it and is going through that work, it may not still be in Kenmore, but it's not removed, it's not being killed.
Well, what we're talking about is significant trees. And so what's the definition of a significant tree? Like take a fir tree, for example, what's the DBH?
Significant trees, we change them all to 6 inches.
So transplanting a 6-inch diameter tree, that is a big effort. So sounds like the chances of being able to transfer or transplant a significant tree is challenging.
Also seems kind of like a bit of a fringe case.
Yeah, these don't really fit anywhere in particular, but we wanted to make sure that we represented all the comments that we received.
But if it's not a significant tree, if it's smaller than significant, people can remove those trees all they want, right?
Correct, and those ones are the ones that have a better chance of survival if you're going to transplant.
Yeah.
The next one was an insurance question that's, I think, been answered by WCIA. So. And then the last one we've already talked about because it's about ADUs.
Right.
It might be all of them.
So that brings us to the end of attachment number 5. I think that just going through this exercise and talking about the different tree codes and looking at it, I mean, we're not going to solve, this is a large, multifaceted topic that a lot of jurisdictions are facing. We won't solve it in one study session. But it sounds like, let me know that the direction for staff is to go back and look at this and kind of like step back a little bit, look at it in a larger context of maybe looking at the different tree codes and putting those together to come up with something that, based on the feedback we've received tonight, which is based on public feedback, that we can come up with a draft. Not ready for adoption, but a draft for discussion. Does that sound right?
Councilor Marshall?
I'm sorry, not on the question of what you just asked. I apologize. So maybe you want to answer that first and then come back to me.
I mean, I think that sounds good. I think, speaking for myself, I would like that when we're done with this, we're no longer talking about the tree code anymore. I'd like us to be done and to move on to other things personally. So, Councilor Marshall?
Thanks. I did want to send you an example of Native American heritage trees and to see if we can think about maybe incorporating something like that. There may very well would have to be some sort of certification or review of the tree by and a relevant tribe. But there are significant Native American heritage trees that have been used since time immemorial to point the way via their branches to a significant area that people have used for fishing or a trail or whatever it is. So I'm interested in anything you can do on that.
Yeah, if you want to send me any information on that and how they get designated, maybe that becomes part of an exceptional tree, but we can certainly look at it. That is all we had for this study session. Thank you for talking about trees again, and just we really appreciate it. We know it's an important topic to you and the community, so thank you.
Thank you. Since we only have one item on the business agenda, I propose we just stay down here for the state legislative session presentation from Gordon Thomas Honeywell Government Relations State Lobbyist Shelley Helder. Thank you very much. Your Honor. Yeah.
I'm gonna do a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you just fine.
Yeah.
Rob, want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to intro Shelley Helder is our representative in Olympia, and she works with Gordon Thomas Honeywell, government affairs and relations, and she has done a fabulous job for us this year. She helped broker a lot of wins on the city's behalf, and I'm excited to have her give this presentation to you tonight.
Good evening. Okay, hopefully you can all see my screen and hear my voice. It's good to be with you tonight and to provide an update on the outcomes from the 2024 legislative session. Before I get started, I do want to note that in addition to this presentation, there is a more comprehensive summary of what happened during the legislative session in your council packet. That goes into much more detail about everything that happened that the city may be interested in. Tonight's going to be just a touch on the high points. So let's see. Trying to advance my slide on my screen. Technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. So I plan to cover 4 topics tonight. The first, an overview of the 2024 session. The second, then we'll drill down into the specific outcomes of Kenmore's legislative priorities. Then I'll review a few additional legislative issues that are relevant for the city and wrap up by talking about next steps. So the 2024 session was the second of the legislative biennium. The second year is always the short session, and it's 60 consecutive days of high intensity action. The legislature's primary objective in a short session is to adopt small changes to the existing biennial budgets. And that's why it is a short session. It's intended to not be as much work as the long session when they have to do the biennial budgets. So those small changes are referred to as the supplemental budgets. And then in addition to adopting the supplemental budgets, the legislature considered over 1,500 bills and ultimately passed 376 into law. You can see from the chart on the screen, the number of bills that the legislature considers each year continues to grow. Obviously, comparing a short to a long session is like comparing apples to oranges. But you can see that 2022, which was the last short session compared to 2024, substantially more bills introduced as well as more bills passed into law. So it's just interesting to see that number continue to grow. Within the political context, Democrats continued to hold strong majorities in both chambers. So there was no change to that. The new dynamic in the short session was the introduction of 6 initiatives to the legislature. And initiatives are pieces of legislation that are sponsored by the people of Washington as opposed to a legislator. And when the legislature receives an initiative, they have 3 options. They can adopt it as presented. They can adopt a different version, and then both the original and the legislature's version go on the November ballot. Or they can take no action and the initiative goes directly to the people. So for 3 of the initiatives that the legislature received, they chose to adopt them as presented. Those were the vehicular pursuits, parental rights, and a ban on state and local income tax. For the remaining 3, the Climate Commitment Act repeal, long-term care opt-out, and capital gains repeal, they chose to do nothing. And so we will see those 3 on the November ballot, and the voters will decide the outcome. So the state has 3 budgets, the operating, the capital, and the transportation. And the operating budget is the largest of the 3. It pays for all state agency operations, the largest expense being the K-12 education system. The February revenue forecast, which is the forecast that was used to develop the supplemental budget, predicted a $1.2 billion increase in state revenues beyond the level that was expected when the biennial budget was adopted. So the supplemental budget allocates an additional $2.1 billion, and that brings the biennial operating budget to $71.9 billion. And I think it's helpful to recognize that the biennial budget was $69 billion, and the supplemental was $2 billion. So that's how small of a budget the supplemental is compared to the underlying. One significant outcome of the supplemental operating budget for the city is an elimination of the 25% cost share requirement for jurisdictions that send new recruits to the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. So that cost share elimination will take effect July 1, the new state fiscal year. The capital budget is the smallest of the three budgets, and it helps fund public and nonprofit construction projects. The supplemental budget was 1.3 billion, bringing the biennial capital budget to 10.3 billion. The additional capital budget capacity primarily came from the Climate Commitment Act, federal funds, and the Model Toxics Control Account. There was very limited remaining bonding capacity for the supplemental. So if not for those other accounts, the capital budget would have been very small. But because so much of the capital budget was funded with Climate Commitment Act revenues, much of it is not available until January of 2025 because it's contingent on the outcome of the initiative. There was $72.5 million allocated to local community projects. That's the category of funds that the city has historically received awards through. And the size of the awards in the supplemental year is traditionally very small. This was no exception. Considering there are 49 legislative districts, each district received roughly $1.5 million. And I kind of just share that for context to know how much money was distributed throughout the state. A couple notable investments in the supplemental capital budget include $127 million for the Housing Trust Fund and over $100 million in behavioral health facilities around the state. The third budget is the transportation, and of course, it funds the state's transportation system. That includes highways, ferries, active transportation, transit, and all the operations for transit-related or transportation-related state agencies. So WashDOT, Department of Licensing, Washington State Patrol, all of those operations are funded through the transportation budget. And this continues to be the most constrained budget of the three. The supplemental budget allocates an additional $1 billion, and it brings the biennial budget to 14.6. Most of the new spending is directed to just a handful of areas. Cost overruns on 2 mega projects, specifically the 520 bridge and 405, fish barrier removal, capital improvements to ferries, and highway preservation. And the money in order to make those additional investments comes from mostly federal funds, Climate Commitment Act, and advancing revenue that was projected to be further out in the Move Ahead Washington package. And again, because much of the projects are funded with CCA dollars, they're not available until January of 2025. And it's worth noting that the traditional transportation revenue sources, which are the gas tax, license, permits, fees, those are all down by 8% since the biennium began. So moving on now to talk about the city's priorities. The city had 6 legislative priorities for this short session. And given the number of priorities and the fact that it was a supplemental budget year, we knew we weren't going to be able to accomplish everything, but I'll just be candid. We were more successful than I expected. The first priority was a request for funding tools for affordable housing. We were mostly interested in tools for local jurisdictions. And the primary piece of legislation that was considered on this topic would have increased affordable housing funding only for the state, not for local governments. That was House Bill 2276 and Senate Bill 6191, which would have lowered the real estate excise tax for properties sales between $525,000 and $750,000. And then it ultimately would have reduced real estate excise tax for many property owners. But then it would have instituted a new 1% real estate transfer tax on the value of a sale price above $3.025 million. And then that revenue generated would, of course, been invested into affordable housing accounts. Ultimately, the legislature did not pass this bill, but I do expect a version of it to return next year. One component of the bill that we were instrumental in getting included was a study for Department of Revenue to provide recommendations on how local governments could institute a tiered real estate excise tax to make that a more progressive option. To date, we've been asking for that, and Department of Revenue has been saying it's too complicated to implement. And so the bill would have directed Department of Revenue to provide recommendations to the state on how to implement it to kind of address that barrier. Again, the bill didn't pass, so it's something that we need to continue to work on. The legislature, though, did mention, I did mention this, they allocated $127 million to the Housing Trust Fund and $34 million to local governments in the operating budget for homeless housing programs and services. Of that amount, there's $12 million directed to King County. The second priority was a request for the state to share some of the revenue generated by the Climate Commitment Act with the city in order to implement projects that would reduce carbon emissions. So we requested $3.1 million for the 84th Avenue sidewalk and bike lane project, and the supplemental transportation budget includes the full amount. We also requested $450,000 for geothermal heating system in the new Public Works Operations Center and received the full funding for that as well. You'll see on the screen, it says that the award is for $464,000. That's to cover the administrative fee that's charged by Department of Commerce. So $450,000 is the amount that will come to the city. Both of these awards are contingent on the Climate Commitment Act not being repealed in November. So the funding is not available until January of 2025. And I mentioned earlier that the amount of money distributed amongst districts throughout the state was fairly minimal. This was a pretty significant and unexpected on my part outcome for the city. So we will see whether it sticks or not come November.
Hey, Shelley, this is Rob.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what happened with 61st Avenue sidewalks?
Yes. Thank you for that. So as you all may remember, 61st Avenue sidewalks is a project that we requested funding for, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and was awarded, I think it's $3 million in the Move Ahead Washington package. When Move Ahead Washington was adopted, they never determined when cities would receive certain awards. They just said, you're going to get this money for this project. Last year, when they adopted the biennial transportation budget, they said the 61st Avenue sidewalk project would be funded in the future. Future was some year after 2027. This year in the supplemental budget, when they were going through adjusting the timeline for different projects, they inadvertently eliminated the funding for 61st Avenue sidewalks. They did that in the final round of development of the supplemental budgets. And so when I flagged it for budget writers, they said that was our mistake. We did not intend to eliminate that funding. We cannot fix it now, but it will be fixed the next opportunity. So I guess the encouraging part there is it was not intended to be eliminated. But we will need to make sure that we're diligent in following up and ensuring that it gets re-added to the list next year.
Well, and Shelley, what I remember happening is that in the version right before it got eliminated, the money had been moved up to 2025, which was exciting and encouraging, right?
Yes, it had been moved up to the current biennium. So one of the reasons the budget writers were even looking at it is because we requested that the funding be advanced from some future year beyond 2027 to current day, or really we asked for any time sooner. And in I think it was the House proposed version, they had advanced the funding to the current biennium. So we were really optimistic, and then in the final, it ended up being eliminated completely.
So it's good news, bad news, good news. So the good news is they're moving it up sooner. The bad news is it got left out. The good news, it's going to get put back in. with the sooner timeline, right?
Not necessarily. That we have a strong case to make that be the case, but there's no guarantee right now.
Councilmember Marshall?
When is the next opportunity or rough approximate date that you can exercise those superpowers, those lobbying superpowers we know you possess, and persuade those guys?
So the next opportunity would be the next legislative session next January.
Councilmember Lutzis?
Was that money for 61st also contingent on the CCA remaining?
No, that is not. That is funded with the Move Ahead Washington package.
And just so you know, we have funding to do other portions of 61st Avenue. What we're talking about is to do the remainder of it.
Okay. The third priority was for the state investment in local fish culverts and stormwater projects. And the supplemental budget allocates an additional 20.7 million to the Fish Barrier Removal Board program. That is the primary way that local jurisdictions receive funding for fish culverts. That amount is in addition to the 48 million that was made in the biennial budget. And it's the largest amount of money that's been dedicated to that program since it was created. I will just note that the Fish Barrier Removal Program is a competitive grant program. All that money is already out the door through grants that have already been applied for and ranked. So some state grant programs, the agency gets the money and then they do the competitive application process. Some grant programs, they do the application process and then they go to legislature and ask for the money. And the Fish Barrier Removal Program is the latter. So while this is a great amount of money, none of it's coming to Kenmore. The city did apply for the grant program and you were ranked on the list. Your projects just came below the funding level. It's not too surprising. Every fish barrier removal grant, every fish barrier removal list that the program has ever created has never been fully funded. But again, this was the largest amount to date. The budget also allocates 25 million to the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. They administer grants for projects not specific to culverts, but to protect and restore salmon habitat broadly. And then again, that amount is in addition to the 181 million that was allocated in the biennial budget. So lots of money available out there for salmon recovery. All of it is through grant programs. The next priority was—
Shelley, can I jump in for a second? So the grant applications for those funding sources, even under the Fish Barrier Removal Board for future, those grant applications are coming open in the coming weeks. And so our best people are on it.
That's great. That's good to hear. The next priority was requesting a change to state law to allow a clean air agency to declare an air pollution emergency during an extended period of unhealthy air that's specifically created by wildfire smoke, and then to be able to prohibit the operations of certain industrial facilities. So Senator Stanford introduced Senate Bill 5535 in the 2023 session. And because the legislative cycle is a 2-year cycle, it was automatically reintroduced in 2024. Again, this year, the bill was never scheduled for a public hearing. The chair of the committee shared that he didn't think it was ready yet. And so I think this is an issue that's going to require much more engagement with the Puget Sound Clean Air Authority, as well as building support from other stakeholders outside of the city, if this is something that's going to be viable in Olympia in the future. The city requested authority to use automated traffic safety cameras to enforce bus lane violators. And Representative Jake Fye introduced House Bill 2384, which is intended to expand the allowable use of traffic safety cameras in response to second year in a row of record-breaking traffic-related fatalities. So this was legislation that was requested by the Traffic Safety Commission. And as it was originally introduced, it would not have applied to cameras for transit-only lane violations. So we requested an amendment to have that authority included. The bill underwent several iterations, and for a good chunk of time there, it would have negatively impacted the city's current budget by narrowing the allowable expenditures of revenue from existing cameras. So in the final version, cities are allowed to continue using revenues from existing cameras as they do now. If a city chooses to increase speed cameras or red light cameras by more than 10%, the revenue generated from those additional cameras will be subject to the limitations in the bill, which are described as traffic safety activities.
We have a question. Councilmember Lucis.
And this might be directed towards Rob, but how many cameras do we currently have in operation?
We have 2 school zone camera locations, and then the left turn signal, traffic signal location is about to come online any day now.
So any additional cameras would be subject to that, since it immediately puts us over that 10%?
Kelly, I think we get 1 more camera in addition before we have to be subject, right?
Right. It's one additional or 10%, depending on how many cameras you have.
The public safety activities language is broad enough that I'm comfortable with it. And Shelley, on the bus only lanes, how did it finally land? I think it was, you have to, for a city like us, it has to be on a BRT corridor, correct?
Correct. Yeah. The originally transit only lane violations was allowed by only City of Seattle. And so the way that they had that in statute was by city population. And so the writers of the bill thought, well, let's just lower the city population to be able to include City of Kenmore. And so we tried that, and that did not work. That would have created many other unintended consequences. So how we achieved it was by saying it's only eligible in jurisdictions that have a dedicated transit lane. So that applies to City of Kenmore.
Okay, and I was talking to the city administrator in Lake Forest Park, and he believes that we won't be eligible until Sound Transit is under contract for the BRT project. And so it's not like we could start doing it tomorrow. Is that your understanding?
I'd have to double check the language in the bill. I don't think that was the intent of the legislation, but I can follow up on that.
Okay, thanks.
And finally, the city supported the state adjusting the 1% cap on property tax growth. So we joined a coalition of other entities that advocated for an increase in the cap from 1% to 3% tied to inflation. But the policy faced really significant political pressure. And in an election year, it didn't advance beyond the Senate committee. Let's see. So in addition to the city's top priorities, you also develop a list of policy statements. So these are the city's position on a variety of topics that may or may not come up during a legislative session. So the complete list of outcomes from these categories is included again in the written report in your packet. But for brevity, I'm only going to cover 3 tonight. So the city supported the state setting affordability goals for transit-oriented development. And that was House Bill 2160. It ended up passing the House on party line and then died in the Senate. It was sponsored by Representative Julia Reed, and she did a ton of work and a really impressive job convening stakeholders and trying to find common ground. Of course, the bill didn't pass. What one outcome was is that the budget includes funding for the Joint Transportation Committee to provide a report to the legislature reviewing the transit-oriented development conditions in cities above 12,500 in population in King, Pierce, Snohomish, Spokane, and Clark counties. So the 5 most populated counties in the state that have the most robust transit systems. The report is going to be due to the legislature in 2025, and it's directed to include recommendations to expand TOD and ensure affordability and minimize displacement. So I have no doubt there will still be new TOD legislation in 2025. But I think, you know, the legislature may choose to wait for the outcome of this report. There was another attempt to establish a paper and packaging materials producer responsibility program. It's referred to as the REWRAP Act. It faced challenges getting out of the House, and so it ultimately died in the House this year. But again, I fully expect for this policy to return next year. It's a major policy and is expected to take several years to get over the finish line. One bill that did pass, though, that's in a similar topic is House Bill 2301. It makes changes to the organic material management. And one interesting, maybe not interesting, significant impact for local governments is that it requires bin colors for solid waste collection to be standardized across all jurisdictions. So that's a change that will be rolled out over the next several years. And then last, but definitely not least, the city supported ongoing and stable funding for co-responder programs, as well as standardized training and certification. There was no substantial increase in funding, but there were 2 policy outcomes. The first was passage of House Bill 2088, which extends the liability protections that are afforded to first responders are now extended to co-responders. It's a really important policy change to attract and retain workforce to support the co-responder field. And then the second item to note is House Bill 2245, which didn't pass, but its intent was to expand the co-responder workforce by establishing a training academy. The bill didn't pass, but the legislature did allocate funding for the University of Washington to develop a co-response curriculum and certification and credentialing program. So the bill didn't pass, but the effect was accomplished through the budget proviso. Okay, so with all of that information, let's consider what comes next. My advice is always to begin with gratitude. Legislators put their lives on hold for the legislative session to do what's needed to continue running state government, adopting budgets and refining the laws. So just recognizing their sacrifice of time with their family, that goes a long way. So whether you see them when you're at an event or around town, I just encourage you all to go out of your way to thank them for serving not only the city, but also the state. I brought this up earlier, but there are an increasing number of grant opportunities available, both in the coming months as well as in the next year. And so there's fish barrier we talked about. There's also lots of recreational grant programs. There's sidewalks, freight mobility, you name it. And Kenmore has done a really great job of putting together competitive applications and being well ranked for those programs in past budget cycles. I'm noting it because it just seems like every year the legislature creates new grant programs. And while it's great that there's so much grant money available, it requires city staff time to put together those applications. And so just want to put in a plug for recognizing how much time it's going to take for city staff to pursue the available funding. And then to also implement any laws that were passed that impact city governance. The next item is our interim is long this year because it was a short session. We have a long interim, but it's also an election year. And so every member of the House and half of the Senate are up for election. All 3 members of the city's legislative delegation are going to be on the November ballot. We'll also have, of course, the 3 initiatives, lots of statewide offices, and a new governor. So there's a lot, there will be many new dynamics when it comes to the 2025 session. And we'll, of course, want to consider those as we're developing the city's legislative agenda for 2025. Typically, we adopt the agenda in the fall. And obviously there's a lot of unknowns, but I would just encourage you all to begin thinking now about the things that you'd like to see the city prioritize in 2025. Because with all the variables, we do have several things that are certain. We know the state's going to be adopting 3 more biennial budgets. And we know that there are opportunities to secure funding in those budgets. And we also know that there's going to be no shortage of new bill ideas. So if there is something out there that we need to change the law in order to improve something for the city, there will be opportunity to do that. So the sooner we know what those big ideas are, the sooner we can do stakeholder outreach, work with our legislators, work with their colleagues, and kind of develop a robust strategy to increase chances of success. So with that, I will end my slideshow and see if there's any questions.
Questions, comments? Councilmember Lutzis.
No question, just a comment. Thank you, Ms. Helder. You did an outstanding job this session. I'm very pleased with all of the good stuff that we got out of this session, and we couldn't have done it without you. We're very lucky to have you. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah, I'll reiterate what the council member just said and appreciate the update, very thorough. And I'm sure we'll give you lots to work on next January. So thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Have a good night. Staff report. Council member reports and comments. Councilmember Marshall.
Well, I'd forgotten, but thanks to Representative Stanford on at least trying to get that bill passed.
Councilmember Sassen.
I have already made a comment to Councilmember Marshall privately, but I really appreciated him calling us into balance during our study session today, reminding us that density and environment and livability are what we're working towards. That was a good moment for me to hear.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
Nothing to add.
Councilmember Lutzis.
A couple of things. The Seashore Transportation Forum met last week. A couple of updates from King County Metro. They're switching to their spring bus schedule. For Sound Transit, just a reminder, April 27th is their opening ceremony, or their inaugural opening of the East Link between Bellevue and Redmond. That opening ceremony is open to the public and begins at 10 a.m. at the downtown Bellevue station. They're going to have a lot of activities for folks, and it's supposed to be a large, just public sort of block party. Also, Sound Transit has ordered an all-electric fleet that will be coming to serve S3 and the Bus Rapid Transit extension through Kenmore. So that is coming. When that finally gets here, it'll be an all-electric fleet. And the Bus Rapid Transit route segment between Kenmore and Bothell is now design 100% complete. So the design is all completed on that end. In other news, Saturday, I had the chance to go down with our emergency manager from NEMCO, Kevin Lowry, and a representative from Lake Forest Park down to Tukwila, where we got to meet with other folks in the region, other elected and senior officials to work on national incident management system training. So emergency preparedness and natural disaster training. So that was a good opportunity and I feel more prepared. So thank you.
All right, I'm sure I'll get the same presentations this Friday at ETP. I want to flag, and Debbie Bent was so helpful in resending out the Arch Housing 101 invitation coming up on May 1st. That's at the top of your inbox. Take a look at that if you can make it. It probably would be worth your time. I'm gonna see if I can work things out with my schedule. The only other thing I wanted to bring up, and for this would be for a future discussion item, so I'll toss that out there and see if anybody will second me. But I do think it's worth, especially just given the conversation we just had, having a discussion at a future council meeting to discuss a council position on initiative 2117, the Climate Commitment Act. Is that a second from Councilmember Shrevenick? All right. Anyway, I just think given how important that funding is, that we should probably take a position. I'm not saying one or the other, but I think we probably should take a position on that prior to November. And I thought I would flag it earlier than later so we don't have staff scrambling, in September to bring something to us. Are there any objections to us having a discussion at a future meeting on that? Okay, seeing no objections, then I'm going to say that we have consensus to bring that forward. And with that, with no further business, we are adjourned.